Welcome to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid. A set of conversations about our government, our politics, and the kind of country we aspire to be. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath, on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
It's not Edwin Eisendrath today. It is Paul Chivari filling in for Edwin Eisendrath on It's the Democracy, Stupid, July 4th, 2026 edition, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The United States semi-quincentennial, for those of you that keep track of those types of categories or names. To prove that I'm live right now, I could tell you that Joey Jaws Chestnut is once again the Nathan's Hot Dog champion at Coney Island earlier today. I could tell you that Canada and Morocco are playing in the World Cup right now. And what that means is I want you guys to participate as we go along today. 773-763-9278, 773-763 WCPT is the phone number here. You can call or text. What we're going to do today is there's some pre-recorded conversations. Edwin talked to Tom Nichols, I think earlier this week or about a week ago. And we didn't have enough time to run it in last week's episode. Edwin was not planning on being here this week. He's going to be back next week. I thought it was a good opportunity to, I think they were going to run that live, or at least they were going to run that new episode with maybe other interviews to go with it, maybe some best ofs for the year. But I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to keep the dialogue open. We're definitely going to run that Tom Nichols interview that you guys haven't heard yet. You're going to hear that in just a moment. In the next hour, you're going to hear my conversation that I had with Professor Kevin Schultz from the University of Illinois, Chicago. I talked to him earlier this week, kind of about the State of the Union and what, where we came from, where we're at now, what parallels have we seen in history, what we can do to save our union and keep it going. And hopefully that maybe we can do this for another 50 years and hopefully another 250 more and beyond. In the third hour, you're going to hear me talk to Professor William Muck. I talked to him yesterday, kind of the same thing as Professor Schultz, but kind of through the political lens that Professor Muck, as a political science professor, kind of tells us about how we're forecasting 2026 and what we should do as, if the Democrats lose in the upcoming elections in the midterms, what those elections might look like, what the Senate elections might look like, and what 2028 might look like, regardless of the outcome of 2026. So I want you guys to enjoy the conversations that Edwin and I had with our respective guests. I want you guys to participate as well. So this top of the hour, you'll hear those conversations. We'll take a break. And then when we come back from those, I want you guys to call and text and let's get the dialogue going. Let's talk about how this is an opportunity 250 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Where are we as a country? What are we as a country? Will there be a country going forward? And I know that it tends to look like sometimes that MAGA or the right, the conservative right, seems to co-opt the 4th of July as if it's, the grandiose patriotism that people display on this day and how proud they are of this country. And I think sometimes there's this false impression that maybe Democrats hate America or they don't like celebrating the 4th of July. But I think Democrats, people that lean left, they look at it in a different light than people on the right. And I want this year Democrats to celebrate the country. You could be upset. The whole point of this country is you're allowed to have opinions and share those opinions. And you're allowed to not like what you see about this country in the hopes that hopefully you can make it a better place for everyone. That's the beauty of the United States. That's why these colonists back in 1776 wanted to separate from the monarchy, from England, wanted to create their own government. It took a lot of hiccups. They didn't have a central government in the first few years. It took a while to get the Constitution. They really needed to figure out that they needed some sort of central federal government. Eventually, they landed on that. There was growth periods. There was stagnation. There was the Civil War. There was world wars. But 250 years later, we still exist. We're still here. We're still a country. We're still a great idea. We are still looked at by the rest of the world as hopefully a shining beacon of hope. Maybe some of the world's perspective has changed in the last few years, few decades. What is the United States in the 21st century? Is this a country that we're proud to live in right now? What would you like to change about this country? Are we a broken system? Can we improve this? Has the rest of the world caught up to us? Has the rest of the world beaten us? Are we still the superpower in the world? And can we still be the superpower in this world despite the conflicts that we have right now, the leadership that we have right now? So I wanted to talk about some of that stuff today, and I want you guys to participate. Once again, 773-763-9278. Hey, let's knock it out early. I always like hearing from Jim from Chicago. We'll get the ball rolling right now. Jim, what do you want to talk about on this 4th of July? Happy Independence Day.
Yeah. I wish it was a very slap-happy day, but I have this feeling that the Republican Party is so regressive in so many ways, and with this guy at the helm. And when you think about take our healthcare system, for instance, it's been bandied about since the beginning, the end of the 19th century. There were people talking about universal health care in the United States. The Germans got it with Bismarck in about 1914, and then it spread through Europe. But why we are so regressive in that regard, I have no idea. And then with all, but Paul, do you feel like it feels like there's some kind of a spell over the United States? I don't know how to put it, but
Well, I guess in what way? I think I might know what you're talking about, but in what way? In the sense that maybe people are too disenfranchised to really be paying attention to some of the things that the Trump administration is doing that's, against some of the precedent that we had from previous administrations?
Well, of course. I mean, think of it. When he's grifted a couple of $1 billion, not only that, I don't care about the money so much. It's just the idea that the DOJ seems to be captured. The court seems to be captured. The media is half captured. And I've never experienced that in my life. When I used to take information, and it was down the middle, Paul. It wasn't skewed by some philosophy. And I feel like I'm living in an era where everything is skewed with some philosophy, and you've got one side or another, and it's just a weird feeling. Anyway, Paul, you have a great show, and thanks for taking my call, and have a good 4th of July, Paul.
Hey, you
Thank
too,
you.
Jim. Go Sox as well.
Yes, dear. Yes, you better believe it. We lost 2 tough ones in a row.
Now they got to steal
right.
2 back from Cleveland, but that's the hope.
But still, I'd rather be in this spot than I was the last couple of years. That's for sure.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, 2024 feels like it was a long time ago.
It sure does. Anyway, Paul, stay safe and your family too. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Jim. You too. Thank you. Yeah, that was Jim from Chicago. You can participate as well. 773-763-9278. Cynthia from Denver. She wants to say something. Welcome to the show. Happy 4th of July, Cynthia.
Hey, same to you. Listen, I have more hope and faith for the people who are younger than 40 years and younger, to reimagine and rebuild our government in their mindset, the way they want life to be and the planet to be, because they're not as restrictive as my generation, which I'm in my 60s, and they're not as fearful. If I hear one more person say they're afraid, I'm going to vomit. Afraid of what? Trump? I don't understand the fear. So I'm hopeful that, the folks that are in their 40s, somewhat in their 50s, can get a hold of our government. And I hate the word socialist, because what does that mean exactly? Everybody gets health care. We make a level playing field where people actually get paid for their worth when they work. I am just so sick of all the fear. And I believe the folks that are in their youth, they are showing that they don't have the fear, obviously, by electing Democrats. I don't want to say socialists, because it doesn't really have any meaning for me. But they just want an equal playing field. So I wish them the luck, and I'm thankful that our country has lasted this long with all the turmoil going on and the unresolved issues. And I just think the Republicans have just been standing in the way of progress for far too long. So I'm counting on us not voting for any Republicans, period, from sea to shining sea, because they are just obstructionists, and they don't want anything positive for this country, the majority of the country, I should say. And with that, I hope everybody is safe, and be kind to our dogs, because my little dog just shakes when he hears all the fireworks, and it takes him almost 2 months to get back to normal. So neighbors, be kind.
Oh, that's a good message. Thank you so much for the call, Cynthia. And right, everyone be safe out there. I know fireworks are illegal in Illinois, but I've been seeing plenty of displays of fireworks out by me, out in the city. Just stay safe out there, everyone. And I like that message from Cynthia, especially too about our pets. We got to think about our pets too. It's so sad to see this time of the year, dogs, cats, all the our loved ones that we keep in the house, our furry ones, that they get freaked out and spooked out. And I didn't realize the PTSD that Cynthia was talking about from her dog for a few months after the 4th of July. That's unfortunate. So hopefully her dog can stay calm today. Maybe some CBD or some sort of calming mechanism for that dog to get him back on track afterwards. But yeah, as far as what she was saying about Republicans and how she doesn't want to see anyone vote Republican anymore. That's the worry going into 2026 is, can the Democratic Party retain the House of, to grab the House of Representatives? Could they get the Senate back? And I saw a report earlier this week that they're forecasting that the Senate will stay Republican. And we know the House is going to be a battle with all of the gerrymandering that's been happening. I got into that a little bit with William Muck. We talked about that. So you're going to hear that in the 3 o'clock hour. I'm going to take one more phone call, or actually 2 more phone calls, and then I'll hit a break, and you're going to hear Edwin talk to Tom Nichols. But let's continue with some phone calls here. We got Frank from Rogers Park. He wanted to respond to what Jim was saying. What was that, Frank? What did you want to say?
Well, Paul, I'm sorry. Just the lethargy that a lot of Americans seem to be undergoing at this time. I hope and pray that at the end of Donald Trump's road, whenever that is, some of his minions may turn out to be weak, sort of like the minions in the Wizard of Oz film, who suddenly became friends with Dorothy and her friends after the Wicked Witch passed away, because it could be many people are calling this cult following, and I've witnessed some cults in my life, the Moonies, etc., and it has a lot of the similarities of a cult, and I'm a former Republican. I voted for Reagan, and he did some good things. He gave us a lot of jobs and things like that. But one thing I did, and I always will like about Ronald Reagan, is that he at least personified or tried to personify or showed the vision of an American ideal, and with pretty good American ethics and values and morals. And I don't see too much of that going on right now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, while maybe Reagan might have been critical of, making up the welfare class or something like that, I don't recall ever hearing speeches where he made the Democrats out to be his mortal enemy and divided the nation. I don't recall any president before Donald Trump really being that divisive in his language. And thanks for the call, Frank. Did you have one more thing?
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, no, I just want to quickly say, as far as national security, Reagan was fantastic.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll let you go. Happy 4th.
Happy 4th, Frank. Thank you for the call. Yeah, it's as much as I disagree about maybe Ronald Reagan, I would take Reagan over Trump any day of the week right now. I think Reagan would be way healthier for the nation at America's 250th than Donald Trump can be. You think about how Trump kind of hijacked the America 250 movement, or the celebration. It's supposed to be this bipartisan thing, congressionally led, and he's leading this the state fair out in Washington, and it looks so terrible. You had the musical acts that weren't even notified, or were, it was a surprise to them that they were even invited to play this thing and didn't agree to it. It's been a bit of a mess. And, the UFC 250 fight didn't bother me as much, but at the same time, it just seems so corny and hokey to have it right there. It just doesn't seem like the right use of our time. And if anything, it feels like baseball would be a better thing to play, in front of the White House instead of MMA fighting sport. It feels a little bit too much like the Roman Colosseum doing something like that, and especially for the president to have it go up against, with his birthday. And don't even get me started about that the guy's birthday is on Flag Day, so I don't ever want to see Flag Day ever co-opted by like a Donald Trump Memorial Day. And we're eventually gonna face that as a nation, that there will be a post-Donald Trump era, whether he leaves the office peacefully or in disgrace or violently, whether he passes, there will be a time where it'll be post-Donald Trump. And what Frank was talking about was there's this cult, and will this be the central figure? Will there be someone leading the MAGA charge in the wake of Donald Trump? Will it be Donald Trump Jr. trying to go off of the name? Will it be Marco Rubio trying to parlay what he's been doing as the Secretary of State in a bigger role to try and become president? Will it be J.D. Vance trying to use what he has right now as vice president to ascend to the role of president? And what will that look like? Will it be Trump leaving in disgrace and people moving away from him? And maybe I think of George W. Bush. I think of how many people in one of the first elections that I voted in that were telling me that I needed to stay the course in 2004 because we were in the midst of this war with Iraq that didn't have an end, this war with Afghanistan that didn't have an end, and that we needed to stay with that. But how many of those people could you find in 2008 when the country was in a recession that couldn't vote for John McCain, where it created this vacuum where Barack Obama could almost come out of nowhere in a span of 4 years and lead the charge because George W. Bush wasn't there for us for the 2 full terms. He was a lame duck by the end of his second term. I don't want to see that with Donald Trump. I want people to own this. I want people to own how bad this whole thing has been going on with Iran. I want people to own that they expected Donald Trump to be better with handling Israel than they ever thought Joe Biden would be. I want people to own the fact that they thought Donald Trump was going to release the Epstein files, and he's in them, and he's not doing anything to release them. I want people to realize that he's always been a fraud. So if you didn't see it, I'm sorry, but he is. And it's okay. We'll forgive you. But it's also, if you want to jump over to our side, if you want to vote Democratic in this election, don't hijack our party. Get to the back of the line. We'll listen to you. It's a big tent. But at the same time, there's a lot of us here that's been here for a long time that's trying to get our voices heard as well. So we got to share that time. We got to do that together. It's a big tent, but we got to change this country in the right direction. Before I go to break, before we hear Edwin talking to Tom Nichols, I wanted to take this phone call. It's Dave from Hoffman Estates. Dave, happy 4th of July. Thank you for calling in to It's the Democracy Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath. Of course, it's me, Paul Chivari, filling in.
Yeah, happy 4th, Paul. Hey, did you get that article I sent you?
I didn't. When did you send it?
Oh, geez, like end of last week. So you should have it.
I'll comb through. Everyone here can speak that I'm pretty terrible about checking my emails, so I'll look into that. But I always appreciate when you feed me some stories.
Yeah, it would have been something that you and Damien were talking about last week, and it was about surveillance stuff and the cars and stuff. And I think you and Damien might find that interesting and that. But that you mentioned about Reagan. Yeah, that they wouldn't even recognize him no more in this Republican Party because back then, if you recall, Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they could fight like a cat and dog, and then come at 5 o'clock, they'd go to the bar and have a beer.
Yeah, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House. Yep, yeah, Democratic Speaker of the House from Massachusetts. Absolutely, and it was a different era of politics, but I'm too young to remember that. My first sort of political awakening was the rise of Bill Clinton, and then, of course, that midterm election where it was the rise of Newt Gingrich, and then, of course, the political rhetoric of Rush Limbaugh and how that was influencing people on the right. And even then, that stuff seems tame compared to what we have now with, Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House, or people like Alex Jones or Tucker Carlson 180. I can't take a right-wing person serious that works in any of these sort of fields anymore, because it just seems like it's just fear mongering and just trying to cape for a party that doesn't even know what they're doing. Just a dog chasing its own tail.
Yeah, because then you had George H.W. Bush when he kept talking about the New World Order stuff, and it was around that time when they started changing. But this thing that they got now, it's a hybrid, it's animal here that they wouldn't even recognize in that. And then who was it, Atwater and them guys, they started with the smear tactics and the hate politics, and then they kind of begat the Limbaugh and that kind of guys like that, But that's
and they kick the door open so that Donald Trump can run right through it and get away with what he's gotten away with. And it's almost laughable that people that follow him don't consider him to be divisive, but then look at Barack Obama, who really was trying to be a great uniter, when he was president. That it's just mind-boggling, the double standard.
Yeah. No, I was going to mention that. Did you see that thing the other day where Peter Thiel was trying to say that the Pope is working for the Chinese communists?
No, I didn't see that, but that feels very on brand, for Peter Thiel, and then the way J.D. Vance talks about him, and the way that everyone wants to give the Pope Christianity lessons. We live in a shameless era. Yeah, I don't know what it is. We literally have a guy in office again after the insurrection of January 6th, a guy from his previous administration that said he was the expert on COVID, even though it looked like he doesn't really have much of medical experience at all. I don't know, Dave, while I got you here, did you see, I have to verify this still, but Trump apparently joking about how he's challenging Taft for the heaviest president. Is that something? Yeah. Okay. Now, what was cracking me up about that, though, is this is the same Donald Trump that I think self-reported in at, 215 pounds when he was arrested back in the summer of 2024. So I don't know if he thinks that William Howard Taft was a svelte man, or maybe Donald Trump was lying to us about his weight. I don't know.
Or maybe, remember when you had that doctor in that first term that looked like the one that said he was the most fittest president ever, and he would have been about 6'5" or 6'4".
Oh yeah. That guy was a total quack too. The name of that doctor's slipping me, but you see the picture and he just looks like he's a cult leader or some sort of mad scientist or something.
He looked like, I'm trying to think of the group, the one, the heads just like to listen to him, going down the river and that, small.
I don't know if I know the reference.
He looked like Jerry Garcia.
Oh yeah. Oh, totally. Mixed with like Bruce Valanche, the comedy writer. Yeah. But just like very unkempt. Definitely a guy that I don't know if I would trust with, doing a physical on me. But apparently he was good enough for Donald Trump, and we had to take him at his word, where this was the most physically fit president in our lifetime, regardless of Kennedy and all the other guys that might have been a little bit more athletically active than Donald Trump. I don't know if I've ever seen Donald Trump move faster than a walking pace, other than a downward ramp. I've never seen him jog. I've never seen him run. I always see him on a golf cart when he's going from hole to hole at Mar-a-Lago. I'm sure I want to say he played baseball when he was younger, so I'm sure there was a younger Trump that had some sort of athleticism, but I've never seen him to be physically fit.
I thought he carried on the tradition of being a cheerleader at that one college or something. And
yeah, right. Yeah.
George W. was at Yale, and I don't know what college Trump went to that time. Supposed to be for the money one or whatever. But
I know. I know he's a graduate of was it Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. An Ivy Leaguer, just like most of them are. But I've also heard rumors that he wasn't really the brightest student at Wharton as well.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I heard he had paid a student to take his exams and stuff for him, and then another one for the picture of the military school. He wore his roommate's jacket because it had more medals and everything on it too.
I mean, it tracks. I don't know if any of these things are true, but it's it tracks based on his behavior. It's on brand that he would not be the self-made man that he purports to be.
Yeah. Well, listen, Paul, let me let you get to your break, but thanks for taking the call, and get a chance, see if you can find it. I think you guys will find it interesting, and then I got something else I might see if I can send you two later. I'll let you know though. So.
All right, Dave, I appreciate it. As always, thank you for the call. Thanks for participating, and thank you for feeding me those stories. I'm going to look into that. I'm going to take a break here. This is Paul Chivari filling in for Edwin Eisendrath on It's the Democracy Stupid. Coming up in the break, you're actually going to hear Tom Nichols in a commercial, so don't get confused. We're going to be back from that break in just about a minute here, and then you're going to hear Edwin talking to Tom Nichols. Coming back in just a moment.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy Stupid on WCPT 820.
It's Paul Chivari back here filling in for Edwin Eisendrath on the 4th of July here in 2026. It's the Democracy Stupid. We do have a little bit of Edwin in this episode. He did record a conversation with Tom Nichols. I believe this we just didn't have time to fit it into last week's episode. We weren't sure what we were going to do for this week's episode, but we knew that we wanted to run it. So here it is for you. I'll be back on the other side of this, and in the next hour, I'll be talking to Kevin Schultz, and then after that, William Muck. But of course, you guys can participate. Please text us, call us, 773-763-9278. And now here's Edwin talking to Tom Nichols.
All right, everybody, come on in. It's my real pleasure to be joined by Tom Nichols. Tom writes brilliant pieces for The Atlantic. He taught at the U.S. Naval War College for 25 years. He writes books that matter, including his 2023 book, Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on American Democracy. You've seen him all over other media. He's out there everywhere on social media, on cable TV, on broadcast TV, on everywhere you can imagine, because he has a lot to say. Tom, I've taken so much from our conversations over the last few years that I wanted, as we approach our 250th birthday, to do something with you and maybe a select handful of others to have this conversation. Imagine we are at dinner. We are lingering over dinner. The bottle of wine is open, and the topic is our American democracy, right? So, the first question I want to ask you is, who else is at that table? Who would be great to have that conversation with? I have my own list, which I'll share with you, but I'd love to hear yours.
You mean living or dead?
Well, I was thinking living. Dead is another interesting question, but living.
Well, I think rather than default to, some of the, celebrities, I think I would rather have a group of ordinary citizens from across the political spectrum who need to sit and learn how to talk to each other about things like American democracy.
Well, that's fun.
Instead of saying, well, former President Obama or, so, I think I would want to put together 3 or 4 people that just never encounter each other in real life and say, and make them actually realize that these other people exist and that they don't have horns.
Yeah. It is you're bringing up such a good point about the bubbles we live in, right? That
some of us live in. Most of us live in some kind of a bubble, but the separation and the sorting of American life is really killing us, and we're doing it on purpose. We're doing it to ourselves. We're, we've really decided that the most important person in the world is us. The next most important people in the world are people who agree with us. And we don't really want to ever encounter anybody that isn't part of that circle. And, it's disheartening because we're losing our identity as Americans. And we're even losing our identity. We're not reverting to where we were 250 years ago, where we'd say, well, I always loved that line in the John Adams, miniseries on HBO, where someone accuses Adams of betraying his country. And he says, Massachusetts is my country, sir.
Yeah. We're not there yet.
We're not even back to that. We're back to my country is this small pod of people that I happen to agree with. In a sense, we've become very small and very large at the same time. So, people say, what's your community? And it's like, well, it's a half dozen people who agree with me, and then it's the millions of people I interact with on Facebook or something.
I mean, was
Uh,
ending the draft a bad idea?
well, now that I'm 65, I can say it was.
Yeah, I mean, people didn't want to go to war. People don't want to have to be forced to give up a couple years of their lives for service. But the idea that we encountered other Americans that we would not otherwise encounter in large numbers had an effect.
Well, and we encountered, and all kidding aside about my age, I mean, I actually did try and join the military when I was younger. I'm colorblind, so they sent me on my way. As it turns out, the Navy tried to recruit me, and then they kicked me out when they found out I couldn't read maps in color.
You got them back by teaching there for all those years.
Well, it is kind of strange, when I started teaching there, I was 36, and one of my I mean, full time when I was teaching her full time. One of my colleagues said, we really should get you a commission. And I'm like, dude, I'm pushing 40. You had your chance. Now you just got to pay me a lot of money. But the thing that the draft did, yeah, it forced people together who had never met each other, and it gave them a common enemy, which was their drill instructor or their company commander, because a lot of them didn't want to be there. So you said,
Yeah.
"Well, I'm going to do my time. I'm going to get out," and then I'm part of a small group of people, or not. Well, actually, I'm part of a reasonably large group of people who have all had the same experience. In my last book, I suggested that the compromise for this was something I called a summer of service, which is
Mhm.
and not volunteer service, not like picking up trash for AmeriCorps or something. I mean, military service, where for 6 weeks after you graduated from high school, because 6 weeks isn't going to kill anybody. Kids go off to vacation in Europe, on spirit quests for longer than six
There are
weeks.
very
After
few human beings who don't waste 6 weeks.
Right. So, you graduate in June and you come home in early August and you've spent 6 weeks. You learn how to live in a barracks. You learn how to make your bed. You learn how to show up, in the morning for chow. You learn how to fire a gun, which I think would demystify guns. I think most veterans that I've ever encountered, especially from the Vietnam and later eras, don't have, they're not really fascinated by guns because they had to live around them. I also grew up with cops who don't have a lot of romance for guns. Um, and then you have a choice. You can say, hey, if you liked this, you can stay in, pick a branch of service. We'll send you off. You get credit for basic training. You're in better shape than you were 6 weeks ago. And if not, you get a certificate that says your country thanks you for showing up. Um, and we will call on you if we need you.
Mhm.
But other
I
than
mean,
that,
the
go
idea,
on with your life and go
yeah,
off to college or whatever you're going to do.
but the importance here is the reason why we're in this discussion is the country seems fractured, and we're looking at ways of mending that fracture.
Well,
Yeah.
and these communal activities break down the biggest problem in American society. I think the biggest problem in modern society, which is narcissism.
Well, that's. I mean, wealth inequality might be atop of my list, but
I know, that's pretty common answer, but I would argue that narcissism is the root of everything. Well, first of all, I'll just argue with you, Ed, and say most people don't really experience wealth inequality in any way they can put their finger on. They experience near wealth inequality. That is, and we know this from studies, that people resent the inequality of the people who are closest to them socioeconomically. They don't really resent Jeff Bezos because most people cannot conceive of being that way. They
that
don't
kind
know
of
what it would be like to rent Venice. You know what I mean? But
yeah. Well, and taxpayers paid for that, but
they
by
don't.
giving them a big tax
This
cut.
is
Yeah.
it's like trying to explain the space program. I mean, it's so far
Yeah.
out there. Whereas most people, where they get really mad is they look at their neighbor and they say, "Why do they have a new car? How did they get a new car?" There's even a thing, and I wrote about this in this last book I did about narcissism and democracy, called the HGTV effect, where people go and they watch these home renewal programs, and it spurs them to spend money they don't have because they're saying, "Well, how come everybody else is putting in granite countertops?" I talked about, and if I see you have an audience, or I can't see your audience, but I have gotten a lot of sheepish looks at live audiences when I've said, "How many of you gone on Zillow and creeped around other people's houses?" You know,
I hit those hearts if you're one of those people who've done that. Come
yeah,
on, be honest. There we
yeah, there
go.
we go. And so, that's to me, that's where income inequality comes in. But I'm sorry, I just compared to, you and I are close in age, compared to the standard of living that we had 40 years ago, Americans live better than they've ever lived. I'm saying there is no way around that. Even Barack Obama once said you would pick no other time in history to be born than now.
I agree with that.
So
I'd argue
if you
that, Tom, for a different reason, for a reason that's relevant to the whole. This particular is like some other times in history, a time that really matters, where what people decide to do matters, because we're at that inflection-y point where you know uh, the moral weight of what you decide to do every day turns out to make a difference. And for young people,
but if you're
that is,
totally
they
wrapped
don't
up,
like it, but it's a gift.
if you're wrapped up in your own thing, if you're wrapped up in your own narcissistic bubble,
Yeah,
you don't think about what the moral thing to do is. You think about what's good for
that's
you.
right. That's
And that's, to me,
right.
that's the problem, is that civic, that sense of civic voluntarism is gone. If you think about, and the middle level organizations in society, fraternal organizations, clubs, things like that.
Mhm.
Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist, he wrote
Go alone.
25 years ago, yeah, that people, he ascribed it to too much TV. He said people that are watchers, people that are watchers are not participators. But you could just substitute screens in general, but also, and I'm going to say it again because of the economic point here, that this is kind of a knock-on effect. It's a second order effect of prosperity, that
I
people,
agree with that entirely.
people just have the
Entirely.
time to withdraw into themselves. They don't have to cooperate to do big things anymore. I'm a work at home guy, right? I mean, I'm a writer.
Me
Even when I was
too.
a professor, I loved working at home. But the fact that we spend so much time in our homes, even before the pandemic, we spend so much time in our homes, we spend so much time by ourselves, has turned us into a mean and ornery people, and you cannot sustain democracy on a bunch of, I'm going to steal a line from Peggy Noonan here, who I don't often agree with her politics, but she was a pretty good
Good
speechwriter,
writer.
good writer. And she said, we have become a nation of sullen paranoids. And I
Yeah.
think she got that exactly right.
Well, okay. I'm gonna change the subject. That was good. Um, but because you taught at the Navy, I got to ask you this. Um, JD Vance and the great minds of the GOP like to talk about Western culture as if they have some clue what they're talking about. So I did this thought experiment in advance of our conversation and thought about my top 5 naval battles of all time. Only I have a tie for 5. And all but one of them, in my view, is a sort of decisive battle for human freedom over something else. Um, and then I think about our wanderings in Venezuela and our clueless efforts in Iran, and I wonder what Western culture these guys are talking about. I mean, my naval battles are Salamis.
If you didn't start with Salamis, I was going to have to just start lecturing you.
Thucydides is my guy.
Well, for your listeners, Salamis, as one historian put it, the Battle of Salamis. This is where the Athenians, the Athenians and the Spartans, who normally hated each other, managed to join forces to defeat the invading Persians, who were the superpower of their time. That remember Greece, all of Greece itself is only about the size of Alabama. And the Persians are this gigantic empire that is pushing into Southern Europe. And the Greeks and the Spartans decide that we might not like each other, but we're all Greeks and the Persians are barbarians. And so the Spartans become the land army and they hold the Persians for a while at Thermopylae, the infamous battle of the 300, right? But they don't, but that's just a delaying tactic. What the Athenians are doing during all this is moving their navy into position to take on the Persian fleet and isolate the entire Persian army where it will be destroyed, because in the end, every major war is about logistics. And the Persians get way overextended. Their navy gets defeated at Salamis. And I love the expression from one historian. He said, the Battle of Salamis is why Western civilization existed at all, instead of people sitting on beautiful rugs, smoking hookahs on the shores of the English Channel.
Yeah, that's right. Am I going to do this? Am I really going to do this? I am. Excuse me 1 second. So I first encountered the Battle of Salamis in 4th grade. And I'm going to do something that's embarrassing. But in 4th grade, I drew this picture of Themistocles. Right?
It's not bad.
That is a 4th grade drawing of Themistocles.
All right. I don't know.
So Salamis was
I
the
mean,
top of
I
my
don't know
list.
whether to admire that or if I would have stuffed you in a locker for doing that, but it's pretty cool.
I got my next one is the only one on the list, which I don't think was a battle that made us any freer, and it's Actium.
Okay. Yeah, the future of the Roman Empire kind of hangs there, but okay, close enough.
Yeah, not human freedom, really. But Lepanto was my next one.
Oh yeah, again, the great face-off between what by this point is Western Christendom and the empires of the East. Could have gone either way, and if it had gone the other way, it would have been revenge for Salamis.
Right. So then I move up to Trafalgar, which I'm not a big Napoleon fan, so I view that as a victory for freedom. But I know that's debatable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that the axis of the world turns on Trafalgar. I might have said, the something more like Yorktown.
Well, then my next two are they're tied. It's Midway and Mobile.
Trafalgar is important because Napoleon, like you, I am not a fan of Napoleon. I mean, I couldn't figure out why Napoleon lies in state in France. I mean, when you kidnap the Pope, you shouldn't lie in state later. But okay, that right. The French, it's a French thing. But yes, victory and basically caging Napoleon once and for all at sea, is an important battle.
Yeah. So I didn't have Yorktown, although I agree with you. I had Mobile Bay and Midway are my next two. And
Midway.
Both of those,
I'm going to say this though. I might have replaced Midway with the Battle of the Atlantic. But Midway is a majestic and accidental turning point, and Midway actually, I keep bringing up Midway in the context of Iran, because for a year and a half, the Japanese do not understand that winning battles, which they're doing, I mean, from Pearl Harbor until mid-1942 at Midway, the Japanese are winning one battle after another, but they don't realize they're losing the war. And my only argument about Midway is that if Midway hadn't happened, it just would have taken longer to defeat the Japanese. But they had the amount, and I think you could almost say this as well about the Allies. And once the Japanese and the Germans had awoken that much productive capability, they were going to lose the war no matter what. It was just a matter of when and how long. And as one of the Japanese admirals said, listen, I've been to Detroit, the The only admiral that was really concerned about attacking us was somebody who'd actually been here. He's like, I've been to Detroit, I've been to Chicago, I've seen that. You don't understand the size of the dragon you're waking up here. And so I think now, had England fallen, and that the Atlantic had, from Norway to Athens, from Oslo to Athens, had become just one big Nazi lake from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, I don't know that we would have been able to prevail without trying to reach some kind of settlement. There's a wonderful book by the way, Fatherland. It was made into a very bad movie, but it came out probably about 30 odd years ago, which was it was a murder mystery set in a world where England did fall and the United States and Germany enter into a Cold War. And it's real. Oh, I just saw somebody mention the American experiment, so I'm gonna flog that while I'm here. Ed, we just dropped that. Netflix just dropped it yesterday. The American Experiment. It's a 5-hour mini series about the founding. I'm in it. Thank you very much, but I am actually not the. I'm just a small participant. There are many more famous people involved in there than me, but I highly recommend it. It's a great way to celebrate the 4th.
Well, so Tom, I took us on this detour through naval battles, in part because I look at what our government is doing with our military around the world and who they're siding with. And I wonder when they talk about Western culture, whether they understand what it is.
No, they think that when a lot of these guys in the MAGA movement use Western culture, Western civilization, they mean white Christians. And that's all they mean.
White Christians were an important part of Western culture, but they were the people in it. They weren't Western culture.
Remember that these white Christians 200 years ago in the United States thought of my people, the Greeks, as swarthy, dark grease balls. Remember that?
Right,
remember It's a Wonderful Life, where Mr. Potter says you're sitting around playing nursemaid to a bunch of garlic eaters. We weren't considered, real Americans or part of that. I mean, white Anglo-Saxons, and Western civilization is about something much bigger. It's about a way of thinking. It's about inquiry and logic and scientific investigation. And politically, it's about, really, I think that Western civilization reaches its apotheosis in the Declaration of Independence. That you can't go any.
I'm going to argue with you about that.
Well, okay. Not in terms of what we achieved, because we haven't lived up to the promise of the Declaration. But you can't go much farther than to say, look, every human being has rights that are inherent in them as human beings, not because they were born someplace, not because they are subject to a particular king, not because of their skin color, their religion, whatever. All human beings are endowed by their creator. And of course, Jefferson was not the most religious guy. But the idea that it is eternal, that you have rights that inhere in you by virtue of your existence as a human being.
Yeah.
And that those rights cannot be bargained or taken or negotiated away. And to me, all of this is kind of the downstream of the Enlightenment, of the notion that that human beings have reason and that they can apply that reason to understanding the world around them and to their relationships with other people. Now, I know where you'll go and say those were fine words. We haven't lived up to them. No,
that's not where. That's actually not where we're going to go.
All right,
but the combination of reason and divine spark, made us all. Yeah, I think we managed to put faith and reason together in Western culture in an amazing way that led us to the Declaration of Independence.
The different, and if you want to contrast that with something non-Western, to say, I'm trying to think of who the author was who said, that the Western civilization has this kind of questing. One of my friends put it this way: try to name any other civilization that was as curious about other civilizations as the West, which I always thought was our strength, right? Now, why does that happen? Maybe it's because many of the Western countries were maritime nations or seagoing or exploring, whatever it was. This is not an argument for the West is best. It's simply an argument to say the West
is different.
This questing nature to it.
I mean, China was a seagoing power. They had the biggest navy in the world, and they burned it down because they said there's nothing interesting in the rest of the world.
Well, I had a Muslim imam in one of my classes years ago who said, well, he said the Muslim nation, and we're here at the U.S. Naval War College. He said, but the Muslim nations had the world's largest navy at the turn of the millennium in 1000 AD. And I said, yes, but you didn't go anywhere.
Well, they traded. They were traded.
Right. But within a very small,
almost even Batuta was not.
In a very small circumscribed area it was utilitarian. It was meant to trade, and it was a huge navy. But the idea of just getting in ships and saying, let's just go see what's over there.
What's out there? That's why we went to the moon. Like, what's out there? Yeah. So we have run out of time. And I'm just going to say this was the appetizer course for that meal that we're going to talk about the country. Because I want to actually follow up with you and tell you why I don't think the Declaration of Independence by itself is the apotheosis of Western culture, but that's going to have to wait for another time. Tom, fabulous conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me. And a happy 4th. And please, everybody, don't let the sourness of the time we live in take away your celebration of the 4th. And what we're celebrating is eternal and not dependent on any one man or any one time in history.
Totally agree with that. Thanks, Tom.
That was Edwin Eisendrath and Tom Nichols. They spoke earlier in the week, or at least maybe late last week. Wanted to get that in on this week's episode. And I'm glad they talked about some of the things they talked about, talking about the Declaration of Independence and just kind of what it means, what they were trying to establish. At the time, it was already a year after Lexington and Concord in 1776. There was already a sentiment amongst many of the colonists that they wanted to break away from the rule of Britain. There was already the Hayes Resolution that America was going to govern themselves at this point, but that was the true establishment. And if you read the text of the Declaration of Independence, it does kind of lay out some of the reasons, like down to the specifics of what they sort of thought that was unfair and unjust coming from the way that they were being governed and how their needs were not being taken seriously. And this is, of course, in an era where, not as instantaneous as we have it today, where you could just Zoom or talk to someone from across the world instantaneously. You're talking about crossing oceans for months at a time. What a different world that was. Obviously, 1776 did not mean that the Revolutionary War was over and that the conflict with Great Britain ended right there. It took a few years later for them to finally get to the Treaty of Paris and finally for England to accept the fact that we are our own nation. And I think it speaks to the fact that here in 2026, 250 years later, the relationship between England and the United States is healthy. You saw earlier this year the King of England, King Charles, stepping into the legislative chamber and speak to our Congress, our bicameral legislators, and just kind of give us his thoughts on this nation and what it means to him, and giving us the praise, but also giving us some warnings for what comes up ahead. And I think that's neat that in this day and age, the amount of peace that you see between two nations. But obviously that doesn't speak to the rest of the world. There is conflict everywhere, but there is always hope. And the Declaration of Independence in the United States and what they did and how that changed the world order and how that influenced maybe other countries and how the United States was kind of a torchbearer for a lot of society from the late 18th century on. But we've got more conversations coming up. You're going to hear Kevin Schultz and I in the next hour talking about a few things from a historical lens. And in the hour after that, we're going to talk to Professor William Muck. There will be some time after those conversations for you guys to participate. Let's have it back and forth. Talk to me. It's the 4th of July. How do you feel about the United States celebrating 250 years? How proud of you are of this nation? What do you like to see about this nation? What are the pros and the cons? What do you like to see in the future? What will this country look like? We're going to talk about that and more on It's the Democracy Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath. Paul Chivari filling in.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy Stupid on WCPT 820.
Back here live on the 4th of July, 2026. It's Paul Chivari filling in for Edwin Eisendrath. It's the Democracy Stupid. And it is our democracy here that we are looking at in 2026. Is it healthy? Is the State of the Union healthy? What is this country? I'm going to talk to Kevin Schultz in just a moment. You're going to hear that. But I want you to keep in mind that as soon as that conversation is over, we're going to hit a break. And when we come back from that, you will have the opportunity to call me, 773-763-9278. There's already been some people that have been on the text line. One of our listeners did not like the Ronald Reagan conversation. And look, I'm not trying to praise Reagan. All I was saying is if it was between Reagan and Trump, I would take Reagan. But obviously it's the lesser of two evils, and we're talking about very evil. And if we're talking about the health of the nation and divisive presidents, I think Reagan was just way more of a peaceful president than Donald Trump would ever be. But as far as presidents go, no, I'm not endorsing Ronald Reagan. So I just wanted to clear that up to that person that hit us up on the text line. But you can also participate as well. 773-763-9278, 773-763-WCPT. But now I want you to listen to my conversation with Kevin Schultz. He's a history professor and the chair of the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I was able to talk to him earlier this week, and we kind of looked at things from a historical lens, where the country kind of came from, what it is now, what it could look like in the future, parallels that we might have seen before, what the hope is to keep this country around so that we can celebrate it for more time and leave it in a good space when we leave this world. And I'm happy that I got to talk to him. So after that, please call in and let's keep the dialogue going. Here on It's the Democracy Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath. Paul Chivari filling in for Edwin today on the 4th of July, the 250th anniversary of this country's founding. And I'm glad to be joined today by Dr. Kevin Schultz. He's the chair of the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's an award-winning historian and as well as an author. Joins me today to talk about the United States and where we are at this point in time in this stage of the game. Professor Schultz, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here, Paul. Happy 250th to the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, thank you. And likewise to you, too. So in your own words, what's the state of the union these days as we celebrate our 250th?
I obviously am worried about the state of American democracy, and I'm concerned about the idea that the ideals that were put forward in the Declaration, that all men are, men back in the day, human beings today is how we would understand that, are provided, endowed by their creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our nation for 250 years has been a constant struggle to live up to those ideals. So I am a little worried at this particular moment. I think like many, many, many Americans, basically every American that's not part of that 20% MAGA core is worried about the fate of democracy right now. But I also, with my historian lens on, know that the United States has been through trials and tribulations in the past. And this is another Gilded Age. Well, we had a Gilded Age 125, 150 years ago, and we saw all sorts of corruption and kleptocracy on the floor of Congress and in the White House. So this is a time with historical precedents, and it's just a grab bag of historical precedents that we're pulling from. So I'm not particularly worried about the fate of our democracy to survive as long as we have a strong knowledgeable citizenry that is willing to fight. And so even though I'm concerned about some of the things I see happening, I see the fight in the American people. I see the No Kings rallies that are going on. I see what's happened in Minneapolis to go and protest the violation of our constitutional rights. So I think there will be a strong and lasting preservation of our democracy. But I've said many times that it's going to be a slog. So it's going to be it's a long time coming. It's not one thing that's going to all of a sudden be fixed, and it's going to be a slug. It's going to be something we have to slug out and fight for. And I do think Americans have been progressively waking up, and the circle of Americans that are aware of the dangers to our democracy is growing. And I do think that we're going to rely and fall back on the ideals that were put forward in our Declaration of Independence and embodied in our Constitution. As flawed as that history has been, I do sense, I'm the hope guy. People always bring me in to talk about hope. And I am hopeful, and I use my historical knowledge to say, hey, we've seen some of this before.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because this isn't a unique situation. It's just unique to this moment. And what were some of the things that were successful in the past to kind of quell some of these uprisings that we're seeing right now with the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, if you go back 150 years to some of the initial labor revolts, we're sort of in a similar battle to what they were in now during their industrial revolution, as you might remember from your high school history classes. This mammoth growth in factories and industrial production that completely changed the way of life. I mean, this is the invention of electricity and light bulbs. So imagine today your life without electricity and light bulbs. How transformative have those things been? Much less televisions and telephones. Those all came later. But we saw during the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century that large oligarchs wanted to control their industries with ruthless measures and keep workers down and be able to maximize their own profits and line their pockets and butter up politicians by paying massive campaign contributions or giving them outright bribes on the floor of Congress sometimes, to sitting vice presidents sometimes. This is the great Credit Mobilier scandal of the 1870s. And what pushed that back was a couple things. The people just resisting and saying, no way, this is corrupt. And the Declaration of Independence was passed to prevent kings from dictating what happens to individual people that is now the country of the United States. Now we have new kings. They're the oligarchs. And how can we organize to push those people from limiting our liberty? How can we prevent the wealthiest classes from limiting what we Americans do? And they pushed back, they organized, they used massive protests in the same way that we're seeing now. I mean, you look at the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and this was a violent protest. Literal protesters were uprooting the tracks of railroads so the railroads could not go across the country. And a railroad connects the country. So if they started uprooting railroad tracks, that had long-lasting effects that went to St. Louis, and then it went to Chicago, and then it went to San Francisco. So this became a nationwide kind of strike. I think back just to the 50 years ago, to the 1970s, when there were all sorts of gas spikes going on because of turmoil in the Middle East. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah.
What happened then? Truckers stopped their trucks in the middle of freeways. They said, no, we have to fix this problem. So the American people have always fallen back on activism. And then they've turned that activism into demanding better from their politicians. And they've demanded that the far left, the more radical left, make concessions with the centrist liberals. And they've demanded and pushed the centrist liberals to make concessions beyond what they were comfortable for. And they ended up isolating the conservatives, which we're actually watching now as more and more people sort of that we might think of as old school Reagan Republicans are falling away from the MAGA movement. And they're recognizing that that's a marginalized idea in American life. And they brought together the sort of center of American politics and the far left of American politics, and they pushed for radical change. So to bring you back to your high school history classes, you might remember the early socialist movement of Eugene Debs, or you might remember the populist movement of farmers revolting against the imposition of railroad restrictions and things done by the oligarchs. They came together and demanded radical changes. The working class wanted the means of production to go into the hands of the workers. And then you had the progressive era, the other thing you might remember from your high school period. And that was sort of the more middle class urbanites, the educated urban dwellers. And they said, holy cow, if we don't do something, we're going to end end up in a revolutionary period. We need to move the politics of our country to the left. We need to take power away from the oligarchs. We need to have things like direct election of senators, so it's not bought and backroom deals to have who's governing us like it was before the direct election of senators. We need to have a greater electorate, so let's bring women and give women the ballot. So in 1920, women earn the right to vote in federal elections. So it was this coming together of this mass of Americans who were responding to all of this groundswell of protest, and they ended up pushing the country further to the left than it certainly was in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. They created a regulatory state that did not allow the federal government or senators or members of House Representatives to try and bribe, work in cahoots with the sort of grand industrialists, the robber barons as they're sometimes called. And so then we created this state that would service and serve at behalf of the good for all Americans. It actually had a vision of what a common good can be. Now, I think those things have continued. The ideals that undergird those movements, the notion that we're celebrating in our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is still there, that all Americans deserve access to right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we need to stand up as a collective people and demand that the people who govern us do a good job, and they actually are responsive to the common good as opposed to just serving the interests of the 1%.
So if my timeline is correct here with the progressive movement of the early 20th century, this was Theodore Roosevelt going against the robber barons, being the trust buster. I see sort of similarities in the sense that with the consolidation of some of the corporations that we're seeing nowadays, the fact that also we have our first trillionaire in Elon Musk, that we're kind of in this era sort of again, who's going to be our Teddy Roosevelt and how can we regulate some of these corporations? I mean, I know they're not having the monopolies that we saw, 140 years ago or so, but it seems like we're trending back in that direction with the consolidation of power, that they want that sort of large monopoly again.
I mean, it's a great question. And if I had the answer, I would go on one of these gambling apps that you can now spend all your money on and bet on the success of that person. I don't know who it will be. I do know right now we are witnessing a titanic battle within the Democratic Party. And it's sort of a civil war in ways because it's constructed of two parties, or two components, let's put it that way. One component are the more centrist Democrats, the sort of abundance liberals that Ezra Klein has sort of named, and they sort of want to take down the regulatory state and allow things to be easier for businessmen so that we can end our housing problem by building more housing and having less regulations so that we don't have to pause and think about how people in wheelchairs might be able to access certain apartment buildings or things like that regulators actually mandate builders do, for instance. And this one is more in bed with the financial industry. And this one sort of wants to see a rising tide raises all boats kind of thing. That's sort of the center of the Democratic Party. And it's been represented very well by many members of the Democratic Party. They don't sit very comfortably, and fewer of them are claiming it outright. But certainly that was, we can think back to Bill Clinton talking about the era of big government being over. And he sort of proposed what he called historically in 1992, the third way, which was I'm going to be socially liberal and economically conservative, because he wanted to have, fewer borders and allow capital to move more freely across borders, something we today know of as neoliberalism. He sort of wanted to usher in that kind of economics because he thought computers and technology was the wave of the future, which it was, but it had all these horrible effects that we're now living with today. So that's one side of this civil war that we're seeing in the Democratic Party. The other side is represented, most sort of charismatically today by Zoran Mamdani, who's taken the mantle from Bernie Sanders and maybe Elizabeth Warren even, and it's the Democratic Socialists, the Social Democrats, depending on if you're in Europe or in the United States, which way you want to call that. And that's a group that is certainly on economic matters to the left of those centrist Democrats. Maybe on social issues, they might not be as far to the left, but that's sort of an open question. I do know that the Social Democrats are getting pretty good at not wanting to talk about identity politics, not wanting to talk about Israel as much, Israel-Palestine conflict, because what they want to talk about are bread and butter issues that affect all of Americans except for the top 1%. So I do think that right now we're seeing the tide shifting towards those social democrats. I don't know who is going to rise up among them to be sort of the person who's carrying the flag. I do want some credit, though. I do want some credit. I wrote a book a year ago. It was called Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals. And it's a 100-year history of uses and abuses of the word liberal and liberalism. And I end the book by saying, look, liberalism and owning the libs, it's become too easy for the conservative and right-wing people to take advantage of that language. So we need to give up the language of libs and liberalism and concede that it's gone. Not necessarily the ideas that were central to it. But I did say that some words that might be on the rise is democratic socialism. I thought that would take, so I wrote that 2 years ago. The book came out a year ago, and now here's what we're seeing. So I want a little bit of credit. I'm not saying I made it happen. I'm just saying that I might have seen it coming a little bit.
I was going to say, I mean, it's it's been kind of bubbling up for a while that the Democratic Socialist movement within the party. Lately, I mean, just with the recent victories out in New York in the primary races and Mamdani-backed candidates winning, has kind of freaked out not only the right, of course, but even within its own party, you start seeing some of those centrist Democrats kind of afraid of what the future of the party holds. But I don't know where I'm going with this, but essentially, it's crazy to how many conservative penned op-eds I've seen lately that are afraid of this movement, that it's, socialist, it's communist, it's this. Do you see parallels, though, of this democratic socialist movement with the socialist movement of the early 20th century?
What I will say, so yes, in some ways, what I will say is that the Democratic Party has been the most successful. It has been at its most successful in passing legislation that is good for the social welfare of the country. The New Deal, for instance, even the Great Society, and going back to the era that you're asking about, this progressive era, when it has been able to carry facets of the sort of farther left components, the Social Democrats or the Socialist Party of the United States, as it was called 150 years ago, and the more centrist Democrats. When those two are able to find common cause and battle with themselves and then collectively put forward legislation, the Democratic Party has been by far at its most successful. When they are at odds and when they battle with each other and do not allow legislation to move forward, when they don't make compromises with one another, let's put it that way, that's when the conservative movement has tended to grow, and then they dominate the legislation that comes through and is signed into law. So I think one of the things that we will watch, and we are watching it now with all of these 2028 presidential contenders, they're being very careful. A guy like Gavin Newsom or Wes, what's his last name?
Wes Moore.
Wes Moore.
Maryland.
I said Wes Morton is where it was, but Wes Moore from Maryland. They're being very, very careful and not taking sides on either of these sort of, are you a centrist Democrat or are you to the far left? And I think that's actually a good sign, because I think what they're recognizing is that on economic issues, more than 80% of Americans think that the 1% is too wealthy. And more than 80% of Americans want some version of economic redistribution. They don't know exactly what that looks like, and there's not a lot of agreement there. But the American population is far left when it comes to economic redistribution. They're less decided on what that actually might look like. But on other social issues, like should we have borders, the American population is, yes, we should have borders. We should also increase pathways to citizenship. We should also defund ICE and not turn it into a military force in our streets that are terrorizing populations. There should be ways that the 14th Amendment should be upheld, which of course this week it just was. So thank you, Supreme Court, even though that should have been a unanimous decision and it wasn't. But nonetheless, it was still upheld. Birthright citizenship I'm talking about right now. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's really interesting for us in this moment to watch our leading politicians in the Democratic Party not eagerly take a stand on one side or the other in this civil war that is going on. And I take that to be a good sign, because they're trying to negotiate between the two. And when the Democratic Party historically has been able to work with both sides of its more radical fringe and its more conservative fringe, that's when they've been the most successful.
every election cycle you hear that this is the most important election coming up. And we know that the midterm elections of 2026 will reflect on what the Trump administration is doing this time around and how the radical changes that they're trying to do here. But I'm looking at 2028, and I think the looming dinosaur in the room is, will Trump run for yet another election? And at this time, it would be horribly unconstitutional. How do you think that would play out if he decides to throw his hat into the ring without having that amendment being changed that he'd be allowed for a third term?
I mean, I
know it's a loaded question, but
yeah.
I know it's something that I think, like, if he's still around in 2 years, I feel like it's going to be faced head on.
Look, in the United States, I have all sorts of beliefs myself, but I know we're a pluralistic, dynamic nation. And so sometimes the conservative factions are going to have more strength, and sometimes our more radical factions are going to have more strength. And that's sort of what democracy is, for better or for worse. And so when I'm watching the Trump administration, Trump 2.0 especially, do what it does, the things that I'm really consciously and carefully watching are the structures and dynamics of democracy. How does it work in practice? How does voting work in practice? And as long as democracy can function, I think that then we will be fine, and maybe we get what we deserve. But when there are these efforts that we are watching, actually, most of the time the courts are pushing back on them, not all of the time. A lot of the states are demanding their rights. We saw in Indiana, a bunch of state legislators push back against Trump's attempt to do redistricting. Trump pushed and fought back, but it was too late. So I'm watching a lot of this sort of messing with democracy, and that's where my sort of the tingling, my spider senses sort of get activated, because I want to make sure we still have the democracy that we love and were promised by our founding documents. There is a way I can see Trump running for president in 2028. He would have to declare some national emergency and say this is not a regular time, and so therefore I'm able to usurp the laws that prevent a president from running for a third term, which were put in place in the 1950s. I do think obviously those would be challenged, and I do think that what we have been watching in the last 6 months is a lot of the Republican Party that sort of sided with Trump because he was a Republican has moved away from the MAGA core. And there have been a handful of issues that surprised me, if I'm honest, on what's led them astray. Surprisingly to me, it wasn't any of these challenges to democracy. It wasn't these redistricting efforts. It was things like the overt corruption.
Okay.
It's sort of like, okay, you know, we thought you might bring about Christian nationalism, or we thought you might bring about regulatory issues that libertarians want. You know, these are sort of the bedrock beliefs of the right wing. Are we bringing about Christian values, whatever those might be? Or are we bringing about, you know, the government needs to be smaller? But instead, what a lot of people have seen is Donald Trump is doing neither of these things. He doesn't really care about either of those things. What he wants to do is just enrich himself and run the country like a mafia, where his family and his friends get wealthier. You know, it's the no bid contracts that is really turning people off. For me, the no bid contracts are what we always expected. And so this is what is really turning you off from the MAGA core. So I do think that he would encounter a lot of pushback if he decided to say, you know, these are extraordinary times and we need to overrule the amendments to the Constitution, and therefore I should run for a third term. I think also he would encounter resistance from within his own party, the people who are currently jockeying for that position, you know, the J.D. Vances or the Ted Cruzes, or some of the people who might be DeSantis, these people who might be sort of eyeing 2028 or 2032 as their time. And they want Donald Trump to just finally get out of the way so that they can continue their so-called revolution. I don't know what that will look like, obviously. I will be very interested to see what that will look like. I am hoping against hope that the Supreme Court does its job and upholds the promises of the Constitution and upholds the actions of Congress and prevents him from running and maintains our democracy. Another case that sort of flew under the radar that was decided by the Supreme Court this last week was one that continued to allow mail-in ballots. So ballots can be received up to, I think it's 4 days after an election, as long as they're postmarked before Election Day, saying that was when the Supreme Court said that was when the voters actually stamped their ballot and sent it in. And that's the moment that actually matters in our democracy. Donald Trump was, of course, trying to get rid of this because he didn't want more mail-in ballots. And the Supreme Court actually pushed back against his incursions into our democracy. So I am hopeful that the Supreme Court will continue to do that. And as conservative as the Supreme Court is, they have provided a few surprises, and especially when it comes to upholding certain aspects of elections and our ability to vote. I do also think that there would be a huge popular revolt on the streets of America if he cobbled together some baloney national emergency and tried to push himself onto the ballot box. I have friends who are Republicans. I have members who are Republicans. I have family members who have gone MAGA, like probably many of our listeners. And it's been really an education for me to listen to them on how they're feeling about things when they come and go, and when they think he's doing a good job and when they don't think he's doing a good job. I do think that there would be a bleeding of support for Donald Trump if he tried to run for a third term. And I know this because when I ask them, do you think we'll have elections in 2028? They look at me like I'm insane. Of course we're going to have elections in 2028. Of course Donald Trump is going to step down and clear the path for some, J.D. Vance kind of person or something like that. So even within his own party, there is this notion that they expect to have normal proceedings of democracy as they've happened in the last 250 years, 200 years, let's say.
But I mean, like anyone that wonders why you would even be concerned about the 2028 election in that regard has to understand that Donald Trump has been so predictably unpredictable that you would have to have, you can't be naive and think that he wouldn't try and pull that or wouldn't try and go against the Constitution. And I think, looking back at the impeachment where he essentially blackmailed Ukraine to try and get the investigation on Joe Biden, and Alan Dershowitz's defense was essentially, well, if it's the will of the people, then he can do it. And then later with the Supreme Court supporting that he was able to, I think it was what the documents was the reason why they gave him immunity. And I think with just that sort of defense and that sort of Supreme Court, that, like you were saying, he would declare a national emergency, or, I heard about the amendment that you could serve a third term as long as the first two were non-consecutive. Any which way that they're going to go around it to try and get an 84-year-old man reelected. But I want to take it back to 2026, and I think, not to get ahead of myself and not to, predict and say that it's going to happen, but it looks as if Democrats may take back the House. And if that were the case, do you expect that they're going to try for a third impeachment trial on Donald Trump? And if they do that, do you think it's just more because they have to as a moral obligation, or do you think they're actually going to be able to get this guy out of office?
I mean, it's a really big question, and it's a really big gamble by the Democratic Party, because there's lots of ways they can go. I mean, like you said, there's a moral obligation. The guy is blatantly corrupt, and he's blatantly stealing from the American people. And I say that, from having heard it from my Republican friends and my Democratic friends. And my Democratic friends say, of course. My Republican friends say, of course. And even people are leaving the MAGA movement because of this corruption. So you talked about a moral obligation. And you'd think these Democrats, if they came in, they would want to do something that is clearly in the conscience of America. This guy is a terrible person, and he's been doing bad things to our country, and he needs to be held accountable. On the other hand, there seems to be a lot of opportunity by attacking him, which has backfired historically for the Democrats. It's given him a platform to talk about the good things that he's done. There's a sense that, this sort of Godfather-esque notion that even if it's a little bit illegal, as long as I'm doing it for the common good, then it should be okay. And why are people attacking me with their Trump derangement syndrome, the TDS that they all talk about, right? So Democrats might, I don't know what they're going to do, to answer your question. I'm a historian, not a fortune teller. I'm a historian, not a prognosticator. But I would say that there is some risk involved in doing what is the morally correct thing to do. And there are other ways that they might go about putting forward all this incredibly popular legislation, knowing that it's not going to be signed into law by him, but actually putting his ideas on trial so that then they have a platform to embarrass him and JD Vance or whoever it is that runs in 2028. And that will enable them maybe to have a stronger position when they actually run for president. So I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know the political calculations. I think a lot of it will depend on if there is this far left democratic socialism, the Platners of the world, if they actually succeed and get into the halls of power, how far they push. And then I also think it's going to take hard conversations within the Democratic Party to say, the elders of that party might say, we've tried this in the past and this is the ways that it backfired. So even though it's the morally correct thing to do, we need to maybe be conscious of the risks that are involved. Are there other ways to get what we want that are more effective than giving him basically a platform and a show trial?
I think of the bicentennial in 1976. The president at the time, the only president to never be elected president, Gerald Ford, he grants a full pardon to Richard Nixon after Nixon resigns. Could you foresee that Donald Trump leaves the office in disgrace and maybe JD Vance gets the presidency and gives him a full immunity or a full pardon so that Trump is not convicted of anything?
I mean, that has crossed my mind for sure, because again, Donald Trump loves power, but he's also, interested in preserving his own wealth and his own kleptocracy, basically. And so I think there is a way that he will want to protect himself over everything else. Historically, he has wanted to cling on to power too much to actually contemplate leaving office in that kind of way, brokering a deal whereby he would step down due to health reasons or whatever, provided that he got this pardon from JD Vance, who stepped in, and then JD Vance would have a perfect platform to run for his own first term in 2028. I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense strategically from a Republican perspective, but there's one big obstacle, and that's the ego that is Donald Trump. So I'm not sure that it's going to happen. But there is a world in which it could happen. I do have interesting thoughts, and I haven't landed on a conclusion yet on, was it good that Ford pardoned Nixon? Because it did allow the country to move on beyond Watergate, which was a good thing in some ways. It allowed the country to focus on real bread and butter issues during stagflation of the 1970s, when we had inflation, but a stagnating economy. So prices were going up and jobs were going away, and life for the average American was suffering and on the decline. So this should be first and foremost in any politician's eye, and it was for Ford. So he wanted this whole thing to go away so that he could focus on the good of the country. But in some ways, it also never brought to task the Republican Party for its wrongdoing. And actually, one of the true beneficiaries of Watergate was the Republican Party, because it crafted and actually enshrined this narrative that all politicians are corrupt, all politicians are eager to do whatever it takes to get elected, all politicians will use the power of the state to go and break into their opponents' headquarters if they have to in order to do what they want. So we need to have small government. So the true victor of Watergate was certainly not Jimmy Carter, who rode on the soiling of the American flag in order to become president, but instead it was this sort of cynicism towards American politics. And I do think that we are still yet to recover from that cynicism. I do think that Donald Trump has been able to tap into that deep vein of cynicism in the white working class, in the recently arrived white middle class. The number one population that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 was not impoverished people, Americans, was not the sort of so-called white working class. It was white Americans who made between $100,000 and $150,000 a year. So that was a surprise when I saw that. But it made me wonder what's going on with that population. Well, they've achieved, really solid middle and upper middle class status, but they haven't yet achieved security in that status. And it was that insecurity that led them to look for a savior who was going to guarantee that they were able to hold their position there. And that was the rationale for them voting overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. So Donald Trump was able to capitalize on that mistrust of government and capitalize on the anxieties of those people. And I do think a successful Democratic politician, our next Teddy Roosevelt, to get back to your question, our next Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is going to be somebody who is able to speak on behalf of those anxieties and really talk about economics in a way that is effective and actually meets people where they are.
Dr. Kevin Schultz, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we go, it's your summer in between the spring and fall semesters. What do you like to do when you have time away from teaching?
I taught summer school because I have 4 of my 5 kids are in college, so I got to come up with some way to pay some of these tuition bills. So I taught summer school, but that just finished. And now I'm reading fiction, which is really, really fun right now. I'm also contemplating my next book project, which is called The Rule of 60, which argues that Americans actually have more in common than we think. There's 20% on the far left, there's 20% on the far right, and there's the rule of 60% in the middle that basically agrees on most issues. And so I'm writing this book to test out that hypothesis.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. We'll have to have you back when that book's ready to be released.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
All right. Well, Professor Kevin Schultz, thank you so much and enjoy your holiday, okay?
All right. Thanks, Paul. Happy 4th.
Happy 4th. That was Dr. Kevin Schultz from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Now is the open forum for you guys, 773-763-9278, 773-763 WCPT. Had a few text messages come in, heard from Dave from Hoffman Estates. Again, always a contributor to what we do here, and you can contribute as well. Got a text where someone brought up that David Brooks, PBS yesterday, had David Brooks's media go too moderate, absolutely losing his mind over Democratic Socialists. At least that's what I think that they meant by DMS. And that's been an interesting thing. I know Zoran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, had a speech today that he spoke to behind Washington's desk, I guess, remarks. And I haven't had a chance to comb through those. But, of course, I know, obviously, people are split on him. You're going to hear people that no matter what he says, no matter how peaceful he says, there's always going to be people that are criticizing him because they're afraid of his politics. But, he's trying to figure out a way to utilize government to help the people. And I think that's always been a philosophical argument between the left and the right is what exactly is the government's role for the people. And me personally, I've always thought, while man is greedy and corrupt, that we have to keep government from getting out of control because of those behaviors, human behaviors. But government does need to be big enough to be responsible for its people. It should not be a foregone. It should not be a foregone concept for people that healthcare for all. You know what I'm saying? And we're the only industrialized nation that doesn't have a socialized healthcare system where you see that successfully working in other countries. And it's not that we don't have the money to do it or the resources to do it. It's just the selfishness of the capitalist society. But at the same time, if you are pro-capitalism, what exactly is this capitalist society doing for you? How could people be this? I was thinking about this today as I was at the Arlington Heights parade for a little bit this morning, and I see these fire trucks going through, and it's like the first thing you see in a 4th of July parade or most parades in general. How it's the chance for the community to flex their muscle, right? To flex what they've got. This is what your tax dollars paid for. This fire engine going by, the ladder, the proud men that want to defend your community against fire and all sorts of disasters, who will go in and risk their lives for you. Taxes are paying for that. How can you go to one of these events and be against taxes? I mean, not that I'm going to sit here and say that I love taxes, but at the same time, I feel like there's a responsibility for the government, and they need to raise revenue. And I think as long as we hold our governments accountable, you could see these dollars work for you. And so when you see this era of the second administration of Donald Trump, where DOJ has cut all sorts of different programs. And we still don't even know. We have not gone through with a fine-tooth comb to see what exactly they've cut. How is this helping us? How do they plan on these things working for us in the future? But then you see stories like, oh, we saved $30 million by getting rid of the screw worms or whatever, and then it costs way more than that to a year later to have to combat the screw worms. You see things like that where the government that is so hubristic that they think that they're smarter than what the problem is, and then don't want to encounter it, and then want to take this sort of hands-off approach to it, like as if they're some sort of liberalism, or libertarianism, but then at the same time also want to have a federal government that is all controlling, and an executive branch that doesn't need to be kept in balance from a judicial that isn't afraid of it, or a legislative that could stand up to it and work with it. And I think it's just interesting, the day and age that we live in, where there basically is fascist authoritarianism leaning in Washington right now with the Trump administration, the various ways that he wants to bypass certain laws, certain precedents, certain rules, while at the same time a guy gets democratically elected in a major U.S. city, and because you don't like his politics, you're afraid of whatever he's going to do, and because you don't like his race or his background or the fact that he's an immigrant, despite the fact that New York City has had immigrant mayors before, that you're afraid of what this guy could do. And it's interesting within the Democratic Party how this ultra scared of the super left. But I know when Democrats lose elections, they always point to the hard left. You can talk about 2016 with Hillary Clinton, how maybe some of the Bernie supporters didn't go in full force for Hillary Clinton. Sure, that's true, but perhaps it's a reevaluation that the party itself has to do. 2024 with Kamala Harris, perhaps some of the uber left was really scared away by what exactly Harris's policy was going to be when it came to Palestine and Israel. But at the same time, just to ignore and sit out in that election, and then only for the party itself, though, to not have the self-awareness to realize that, yeah, well, Kamala Harris, the timing of her as a candidate, and the fact that they really didn't do enough to really feature her during the Biden administration to prepare her to be the bridge from a one-term Joe Biden administration. That was a mess in terms of the planning and how that summer played out, and you can talk about how that was a factor in which led to the Democrats losing 2024 when it should have been there for the taking. But only for the Democrats to do a report and then say, well, we're going to sit here and wonder why that didn't work out, only for them to be like, well, we've spent a bunch of money on this report, and the report tells us that we felt that she wasn't prepared, or at least displayed enough in front of the people as if she was prepared for this, because we kind of kept her in hiding for 3 years. And that was stuff that I was saying back then, that I think we needed to see more Kamala Harris before she became candidate Harris, and that was a big reason. But of course, the super left gets blamed for that, and how maybe they were scared away. Of course, the centrists and the right, and the fact that there's always misogynistic and racist reasons why certain people don't get elected. In this case, Kamala Harris. But I think it's an evaluation that the Democratic Party needs to look at. Where, look, regardless whether you like it or not, your party has a lot of people with ultra left philosophies, and some of the identity politics has been kind of taken out of it. I think you heard Professor Schultz say that in that previous conversation that we just had. But I think it's also just one of those things that it's the wave of the future. The argument is, you could say, well, look at MAGA, look at the ultra right, look at how they hijack that party. But I think that's a little bit different. I think the ultra left is a little bit more of a party that isn't going to completely dismiss or alienate those that oppose them. I think the ultra left has been showing that they're willing to have the tough conversations, willing to compromise, willing to make this something where everyone can have their voice heard. Whereas I don't see that from the MAGA right. I see alienation. I see dismissal of people's opinions. I see people on the right thinking that I'm a terrorist, or I'm anti-American, or I'm an enemy to the state. And I don't think that helps the country at all. I think when you're pointing the finger at your fellow citizens just because you don't like what they believe in and lessening them to the point where you don't think that they have a right to even say what they think. I see a lot of people saying, if you don't like this country, leave. And the thing is it's a lot of money. It takes another country even wanting you. And the fact that, no, we're here. And what's weird is the rule book says that we're allowed to help try and push this into a direction of the will of the people. So you're stuck with us, righties. All of us on the left, we're here, and we want to make this a better place. And it's going to have to be majority vote, and it's going to have to be the Electoral College in order to get the president that we want. And there's systems in place that really do protect Republicans, but and there's going to be an interesting election coming up in 2026 to see what sort of voter suppression that we're going to see that's going to try and keep mail-in balloting or anything that you see the left kind of lean towards in their style of elections. Still have yet to see the 2020 election be actually proven that it was stolen. So until then, it's just insurrectionist garbage. And it's really scary in this day and age that people consider themselves patriotic Americans when they don't even know what they believe in or stand on and can't even prove it. So wanted to take some phone calls. Got a few people on the line right now. Let's go to Steve in Chicago, who's on the line. Steve, what did you want to talk about today? Happy 4th of July.
Happy Independence Day to you. So just to put things in context, I'm a 60-year-old white gay man, voted Democrat virtually his whole life, grew up in the East Coast, recovered Catholic, et cetera, et cetera. And I keep saying about 2016, 2024, stop, one, blaming individual groups, and two, defending individual groups. If you did not vote for Clinton in 2016 and you did not vote for Harris in 2024, you've got blood on your hands. With that perspective, I've also got to say, yes, most of the people on the extreme right have opted out of my life, but I've still got a pretty wide variety of people from the very far left to the center to slight right. And the argument I keep having over and over again with the extreme left, and I'm probably left of center if I'm going to be labeled somehow, is the inability to understand that if you make choices that appeal to the extreme left, you are going to lose people in the middle and the soft right. And there seems to be this attitude of, no, you have got to give me my perfect candidate. I won't vote for you, or I'll argue against you if I don't, and I expect everybody else in the party to fall in line. You've got to compromise. I've seen it in my lifetime. I was very angry with Bill Clinton when he did Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I've come to recognize that was a path towards what we were going to eventually get. I was very hesitant about Obama because he didn't come out in favor of marriage equality. I came to understand we had to get him in there so that he could follow through on it. You have to be pragmatic. This whole thing of we've got to have exactly what we want right now, and you've got to announce it publicly to everybody, and you're going to lose the votes you need to get into office. It's just the reality that we live in this country. It's not the reality I want, but it's the reality we have. You have to be pragmatic.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to after Harris lost, how you see this pivot now as if the party's like, well, we need a white male again. And it's sad that that seems to be a compromise that the party has to make because you can't see growth and emotional change out of the middle and the right that can't wrap their heads around a woman president or can't wrap their heads around someone that maybe has a left of center view. But it's crazy, though, to think how slow the Democratic Party did accept, gay marriage or just appreciating the LGBTQ community, because now is much a part of their identity on the left. But yeah, I think you're right that it's an era where we have to be pragmatic. We have to see the Democratic Party try and pull in the left, and people on the far left also have to realize too that you have to pull the people from the center on your side. But you're all on the same team, and if we don't work together, it's still going to be people that are complete polar opposites of us that are going to be in control of the country. But Steve, I want to thank you for the call. Happy Independence Day, and don't be a stranger, okay?
All right. Take care.
All right, take care. All right, 773-763-9278. Let's go to another phone call. We got Brian calling in from Albuquerque. Happy Independence Day, Brian.
Hey, happy 4th. So much to talk about. I think, the Democrat Party is not popular with Americans. And of course, most Americans don't know their history, which is a big problem. So we need to get back to fundamentals and explain to people how our economy evolved, and that, the big fear is socialism now, and the right wing is trying to scaremonger. Well, why don't we tell the story of socialism in America? Because our country is a hybrid economy. It's part capitalist and part socialist. And I could think of 100 examples, but nobody tells the story. Like, imagine New York or Chicago without any mass transit or any centralized sewer and water system. It would be chaos. It would be filthy. But, so it was those evil socialists that came up with a plan for the city and spent taxpayers' dollars to build something that everybody could benefit from. And, if you travel on an airliner, the airlines don't pay for the airport. All the airports you travel to are paid for by the taxpayers. The gas on jet fuel isn't enough to build, the recently revamped O'Hare Airport. There was a ton of federal dollars in that. And it's the same for every project, for all the water systems, the river systems, the locks, the dams, the reservoirs, all of it. And, that story needs to be reminded or told to people again, because they're just oblivious to everything that's in front of you. And it didn't just grow there. It was planned and built and paid for with taxpayer money, but everybody just forgets about it. And I think, am I still there?
Yeah, you're still here,
sorry.
Brian. You're rolling, man. You're rolling.
I wanted to go to another issue with the Democratic Party. All right. Bill Clinton made a lot of huge mistakes with neoliberalism. It went way too far in favor of the capitalists. Average Americans got screwed, and wealth is concentrated in this country. And, we need to explain how that happened. And, if we want to go to a more socialist side of the equation and make our society more socialist, that means a lot of rules, and rules have to be enforced. Like, I'm a retired electrician. I was in the electricians union. I know my parents are both in unions. Most of my uncles were in unions. And for unions to work, there have to be rules, and they have to be enforced. But the problem the Democratic Party has in a lot of mainstream America's eyes is they're very lackadaisical about enforcing rules. They let things go. They let things slide. They blow through budgets. It's just like Illinois has a huge budget problem. And historically, it's because these great, generous pensions were promised to state employees and city employees, back in the 80s. But then the politicians, the Democratic politicians in Illinois, didn't fund the pensions. That's why you have this huge problem. So that's why people don't trust Democrats, is because they get away from the fundamentals. They don't talk about what the rules need to be and how the rules need to be enforced. And for Democrats to just sit there and say, like, well, the billionaires are going to pay for everything, like Bernie Sanders. Oh, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, they're going to pay for all the health care everybody in the world. That's not true, and we need to start getting back to fundamentals and talk about how problems are going to get solved. Like, I am against the lax immigration policy we've had for the last several decades. And Democrats always want to push immigration into a racial discussion. It's an economic discussion, and we got to talk about the numbers. And what are we going to do when people break the rules, whether they're an immigrant or an employer or whatever? If you think we're going to go to this utopian society of socialism where everything is paid for and everybody gets a standard basic American lifestyle, compliments of the taxpayer, I think you're crazy.
Yeah, and I think we're far from that, though. I think that's the boogeyman in the room. I think when people talk about socialism is that it's supposed to be some sort of like dictatorship where everything is paid for by the government. And I think all the democratic socialists are even looking for right now is like, man, we're just asking for health care. We're just asking for like maybe a free bus ride. I think there are certain infrastructure related things for the will of the people or the good of the people that the government can provide, because I think we have the resources and the money. But I think when you start saying socialism, I think there are people that automatically equate it with communism, but then start thinking about the rhetoric of the mid 20th century, the Cold War, where they're afraid that we're going to turn into what Vietnam was going to turn into, or what we've seen in Mao's China. And I think America is way far, and our just fundamental basic system is made to prevent that from happening overnight. And it's funny, the projecting I see from the right where, we don't want a dictatorship, or we don't want socialism. It's like, but they're perfectly fine with fascist authoritative government. So a lot of the times when I see when people, especially from the right, when they talk about what they're afraid of and what they see in just Democrats in general, it's always a lot of projecting. And I think no matter what the political spectrum, like remove the emotion out of politics, remove your philosophy, or at least where you lean towards politically, and you see that when unchecked, no matter what philosophy or whether it's left or right, no matter what country or what government system, it can get out of hand. And that's why I think the forefathers,
right,
when they started this country, they wanted to at least create these guardrails where, it shouldn't get too out of hand as long as you guys play by the subset of rules that we've created for you. But here we are in the Trump era where we have a completely rigged Supreme Court caping for certain things with Donald Trump. But even just the fact in the day and age with the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, how you still have 3 Supreme Court justices that don't see it the way or interpret it the way that it was written. So it's a very weird era. And then just you brought up immigration earlier, Brian, and thank you for the call. Just how Biden tried through executive order to try and expand the immigration courts, and just the fact that Republicans were kind of sitting on that for a while in 2024 on the request of Donald Trump to not let Biden or the Democrats get any sort of victories or gains to try and overhaul immigration, or at least try and do some sort of change to immigration. Whether they agreed to or not, the fact that they wouldn't even come to the table with each other, I think demonstrates to me how insincere the right truly is when it comes to the way that they want to legislate immigration, because they wanted to wait to the will of Donald Trump. And then you see the way that Donald Trump has abused the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. But Brian, I want to thank you for the call. I got to jump to a break here. I see Paul from Seattle is waiting on the line. When we come back, I'm going to take Paul's call, and then you're going to hear my conversation with William Muck. It's Paul Chivari sitting in for Edwin Eisendrath. It's the Democracy Stupid right here on the 4th of July here in 2026. Join us for the next hour.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy Stupid on WCPT 820.
It's Paul Chivari filling in for Edwin Eisendrath on It's the Democracy Stupid. Edwin will be back next week. We are live here on the 4th of July. However, some of the conversations that you have heard, me talking to Professor Schultz, Edwin talking to Tom Nichols, those were pre-recorded. But there are segments right now like this one where I am live right here, 3:03 in the studios of WCPT. I believe Morocco defeated Canada today in the World Cup. Another game going to be taking place in Philadelphia in the World Cup. So yes, we are live today right now. Joey Chestnut winning once again, although you could probably over the last 20 years record something on the 4th of July and say Joey Chestnut won because he continues to be the hot dog eating champion of the world. But yes, we are live, so please call us when the opportunity presents itself. I'm going to take one phone call right now because Paul from Seattle has been holding on the line for a long time. I wanted to make sure that I got him in, and then you're going to hear me talk to Professor William Muck, but there will be time after that, around maybe 3:40 or so, that you'll have a chance to call in at the end of the show like you normally can on Edwin's show. He will be back next week, so bear with me for the next hour. And then, yes, next week you'll have Edwin Eisendrath back once again on his show, so you don't have to deal with me anymore. But let's go to Paul from Seattle. Paul, happy Independence Day. Thank you so much for calling in.
Hey, same to you, Paul, and doing a great job. So I'm glad to have you on.
Thank you.
So, by the way, a quick American history trivia point. I'm counting, other than Gerald Ford, 4 other vice presidents that ascended to the presidency that were not elected.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. John Tyler, 10th president, was vice president to William Henry Harrison, who made a 2-hour inaugural address in the rain and fell ill and died 2 months later. And Tyler was the 10th president in 1841.
But wasn't that still when
there
wasn't that the whole thing where Congress still determined who the vice president was, and not so much like a ticket? You know, like it wasn't like a Harrison Tyler ticket, but it was like Tyler, if my history is correct here, Tyler was second in electoral votes to Harrison, and that's why. So, okay, so you're getting me on a technicality, but I guess where I was going with that was how Ford was appointed basically after Spiro Agnew was impeached, and that's, you know, so it wasn't necessarily that Ford ran on a ticket with Nixon, but what were the other 3? Because I kind of live for this kind of history.
There was. Same thing happened with Millard Fillmore was vice president to Zachary Taylor.
Yep. And Taylor died in office.
Yeah, and then, of course, Andrew Johnson was vice president to Lincoln.
And that was
he was never.
Wasn't that like a compromise, right? He was a Southern Democrat to Lincoln being a Republican, so it was like almost like a compromise to. And of course, Johnson very unpopular, the first president to be impeached.
Yeah, that's right. And then Chester A. Arthur, or as I call him, Chester B. Arthur.
That's a good joke.
Yeah, that he. When James Garfield was shot and died of actually blood poisoning from the injury, about 8 months later, then Chester Arthur became president, and he was never reelected. So those are the 4. And then the ones that were elected were Teddy Roosevelt. After McKinley was shot, he took over as vice president. He was reelected for 2 additional terms, because he was eligible because he only served the last, if you serve less than the last half of the president before your term, then you're eligible for, of course, and the 22nd Amendment hadn't been passed yet anyway. So, yeah. So then, Calvin Coolidge Harding died in office, and Calvin Coolidge was elected president in 1924, and then Truman.
Okay.
He was elected.
Okay, but I guess at the very least wasn't.
And then you got Lyndon Johnson was elected.
But I guess my point was some of those guys were on the ticket with their respective president that they replaced, whereas Ford was not in the 1972 election, and. But also I forgot, was the 12th Amendment or whatever that determined how we elect our presidents and vice presidents. So you bring up, I live for this type of trivia, Paul. So I appreciate you telling me this.
But those guys, those ones I mentioned, they were presidents and didn't have vice presidents. Tyler didn't have a vice president.
Okay, yeah.
There were no vice presidents, and neither did Millard Fillmore, and neither did they didn't have vice presidents.
Well, I think that predated like the line of secession that they eventually came up. I think it was during Roosevelt, like Franklin Roosevelt. I want to say is when the country kind of figured out that maybe we should have a contingency plan if someone can't fulfill their duties. But thank you for that trivia lesson. And I think about too, like we celebrate these different parts that every 50 years or whatever, how it's been always basically Republican presidents. Donald Trump in 2026, Ford in 76. I had learned today that for the 150 with Calvin Coolidge in 1926, that they had like a commemorative coin that had Washington and Coolidge's face on it. And I guess that gave me like a little bit of relief in this day and age where Trump is quick to compare himself to other presidents or put himself out there with other presidents, that at least that this has happened before. And then, of course, 1876, I think about where this country was at with Ulysses S. Grant in charge, and still how we were about to get to the Reconstructionist era with the Tilden losing to Rutherford Hayes in that election and all of that, and just how far we've come as a country so that, in this day and age, at the very least, we can complain about Donald Trump, but at the very least, the nation is at least healthy enough to function on some regard where it's not going to fall apart today, God willing.
Well, let me point something out here about the Declaration is that some misunderstood words, and often quoted, is that we take it as these truths to be
self-evident.
Sorry, self-evident that I don't have in front of me, but that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, among those being the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So we see the word certain means that the set of unalienable rights is finite. And among those means that these are three important ones, but there are others, right?
Yeah.
Because when we say certain, that means it's a limited set. And among those being, these aren't all of them. Okay, so these are by our Creator. But we, as you can tell, we don't, our country, your rights to life and liberty can certainly be abridged, I guess, if you're convicted of a crime, and that definitely puts the kibosh on your pursuit of happiness. But so endowed by the Creator, I would say that maybe not. But going into the preamble of the Constitution, when we look at this, and I teach this is that people read the preamble is that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more, it sounds like the beginning of a great speech, but it's one sentence. And then it goes into all this blah, 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 like people just, the rest of it just bounces off your eyeballs. And that's because it's really not the beginning of a speech. It is a goal statement. It's one sentence that says, these are the goals. We the people, first of all, says who's writing this. We the people of the United States. We are writing this. It's not the federal government creating us. We are creating a federal government for this reason. And those 6 reasons are, first of all, to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, right? To ensure the domestic tranquility was because after we won the revolution and we had the Articles of Confederation, we didn't have those things. We didn't have a perfect union. We didn't have justice the way we needed. There were some hot fights between the states. There was a lot of disharmony here before we had a constitution.
And from my rough understanding of the Articles of Confederation, it was they really didn't want a central government, so I could see that the 13 states would have a bunch of infighting to kind of, it was like each state got one vote in Congress, and I'm sure that, if there was a split vote like 7-6, that it could have caused some problems. And then I think it was the fact that it was like self-funding. What was it, like the Shays Rebellion or something like that? Where they kind of realized that maybe perhaps the government needs to have some sort of way of paying their debts or raising revenues or being able to control sort of uprisings. If that's a correct way of interpreting that.
Yeah, and the states had different currencies, different money.
Yep. Yeah, that was crazy to me learning that the states could print their own money at that time.
Yeah, and that was not good for business with other, European nations because it's like, well, wait, who are you guys? We don't know if any of this is worth anything. But just to kind of go quickly forward here, because your question kind of at the beginning was, where are we and where do we need to go? Well, in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt presided over the Human Rights Conference, in which the Declaration of Human Rights was drafted. It has 30 fundamental human rights on it. But here's the thing: when we talk about that sentence we just talked about, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. And endowed by our Creator with certain, which people think that all of our rights come from God. No, not necessarily. But one would have to argue that human rights kind of do come from God, right? These 30, and you can look these up online, the Declaration of Human Rights, but the United States has not adopted them. The United States, it was done, this was drafted in the United Nations in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt presided over the conference. But the human rights was broken. The Declaration of Human Rights was broken up into two pieces, into the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, there's 15 of them, and the Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, which are things like you have a right to medical care, you have a right to whatever family you decide you want to have, these kinds of cultural rights. You have a right to an education. The United States has only adopted the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is kind of echoed in the Constitution. But most European countries have adopted both covenants. And the problem is I think our conservative kind of bent in this country has decided that the Covenant of social, cultural, and economic rights is inconsistent with the Constitution. That you can't, believe it or not, you can't read the Constitution to include those things. I don't agree. I think you can read the Constitution to include, if you're going to say in the Declaration of Independence that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Those, remember I said certain, among those, meaning there are more, and I have to think that these other ones are the more, that it would be ridiculous to say that the Constitution doesn't accommodate those. So I think we need to move forward to adopt all of the human rights that were drafted in those covenants that were drafted in the Declaration of Human Rights.
Oh, it's a great point, Paul. Thank you so much for the phone call. And yeah, I mean, even in both documents, like they say, we the people, as if the people of the United States are dictating the Constitution and the preamble and not the government dictating it back to the people. And then the fact that even in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, that it's like that to secure these rights, the unalienable rights that Paul was talking about, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, meaning the people. And yeah, Paul raises a great point, and I didn't know about that, about the United Nations, and that that the United States didn't adopt that set, versus Europe that adopted both sets. That's really interesting, and it's just the fact that even at the Declaration of Independence, when they're saying that all men are created equal, while simultaneously there was slavery also happening in the United States, proves that also that in 1776 that we still had a long way to go before mankind could really grow and be as emotionally mature as society is nowadays versus where we were 250 years ago. So that's a great point, Paul. I thank you for the call. I got to move on to this conversation that I had with Professor William Muck, but I'm leaving room at the end of the show. If you guys want to call in, there should be a few minutes to take a call or two. 773-763-9278. There'll be that in just about 40 minutes, but here is me talking to Professor Muck. Welcome back into It's the Democracy Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath. This is Paul Chivari filling in for Edwin today here on the 4th of July, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And with me today, I have the professor of political science at North Central College, co-host of the podcast Politics Lab, and minority owner of the Green Bay Packers, as I'm finding out right now, Professor William Muck, who you've heard on this show as well as other shows here on WCPT, and he joins me today. Thank you, Bill, for being here today.
Hey, Paul, it's a pleasure to be here. Happy 4th of July. What a good day to have an important conversation.
Happy 4th of July. And going into this 4th of July, I feel like there's like a malaise in this country of all of the people on the left side of the political aisle that are just kind of like, this is a nice celebration, but we're kind of in the middle of something with the state of this country right now, and all the people on the right celebrating this, despite the fact that you see this state of, the state fair in Washington, D.C. that nobody's showing up for.
Nobody's showing.
The reflecting pool is chipping away, and people are being blamed for its shoddy craftsmanship. But Professor Muck, could you tell me in your own words, what's the state of the union right now here on July 4th, 2026?
I think it's not a particularly good one, right? As we think about, I've always been a huge fan of the 4th of July. It's just a wonderful holiday. And we think about why so many of us love the 4th of July. It's because it has traditionally been a nonpartisan celebration of who we are and most importantly, who we are as a political system, right? So the 4th of July is celebrating the political system we created, our democracy, liberty, the founding fathers, the revolution, all of that, which is separate from any sort of ethnic identity or religious identity. The idea is that we come together as a country and celebrate our democracy. And that's so distinct. You think about other parts of the world where, identity matters, ethnicity, all race, all of those things. This is one of those holidays where we celebrate a political system. And as you noted, it's become more difficult to celebrate that because the Trump administration, I think Trump in particular, has made sort of patriotism partisan. And so I think that it's hard to celebrate these sort of civic days when partisanship is such a heavy sort of hangs over all of our head right now. So again, I'm still trying to enjoy, but it's more difficult to enjoy given the sort of difficult place we all find ourselves.
It feels like in the Trump era, going back at least 10 years now, that the Republicans have kind of co-opted patriotism. And do you feel that the Democrats aren't taking the initiative to try and take that back and make it kind of bipartisan?
I think they've tried, right? So when you think about national conventions, they bring out all the flags and everything, but it's more difficult for them to do so. And I think some of that is the nature of Democrats, right? Democrats tend not to be the ones who love to be out with the flags and celebrating those kind of dynamics. It's just a different ideological focus, and it plays so well for Republicans when they do this. But again, it's unfortunate because it pulls that ability to unite everybody. And again, to his credit, Trump has been very, very strategic in leaning into sort of this traditional sense of patriotism and flag. And then the net effect is like many of us have been left on the outside of that because we feel, if we're out there waving our flag, it almost feels like a political sign now, right? If you put your flag out, is that any different than wearing the MAGA hat? And it's a sad place that's sort of where we're at right now.
I suppose it helps that at least like Trump has his own flags and his own sort of branding that at least like takes it away from, the iconic look of the stars and stripes and Old Glory. But I don't know. How do you think we got to this point, though, where, kind of the Democrats kind of losing their patriotism in identity? And while in the meantime, I know the probably obvious answer of this of how we kind of lost our democracy under Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, and I think some of this also, I think the Democrats are a little bit responsible for this as well, because there is an element of elitism in the party where, a lot of us shy away from that kind of stuff. And Trump saw the opportunity to lean into it, and we've seen this in other parts of the world as well. Go down to Brazil, Bolsonaro, the former president, he did all of this. Like he leaned into the flag and it had that effect of dividing the country. Now, I think moving forward, you've got to find a way to sort of step outside of this traditional partisanship, and Democrats have to embrace the idea of celebrating the country. And hopefully, we move past some of sort of in some ways, all this Trump partisan stuff and sort of, it's so over the top, right? Hopefully we can find a middle ground where we can celebrate the country and not celebrate it in such a partisan way, because I think everybody wants to enjoy that.
Well, I mean, obviously controlling, the Supreme Court, regardless of their decision on birthright citizenship, which went against what Trump wanted, and he's still so confident that he can get his way on the matter. But just having the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial all leaning right, do you foresee the Democrats losing in the midterms and that sort of right-leaning majority still is retained in all three branches?
It's a really important question. I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but I think this sets up well for the Democrats to take back the House. The Senate is a different conversation, right? The institutional structure of the Senate is going to make it more difficult. And you hear Democrats talking about they see a pathway to taking the Senate back. It's a difficult pathway. I think winning Texas is still really difficult, but it's possible. So I think there's a way that you can get the House back. I think that's more than likely. And when that happens, you start to you slowly shift that balance of power. But your point is really an important one. The entire system of government is leaning toward Donald Trump right now. We see a Supreme Court that is enabling Donald Trump, both in terms of some of his sort of petty issues, but also in terms of executive power. we see a Congress, a Republican Congress, that's unwilling to stand up to him, and in the process giving him more and more power. And when we think about on the 4th of July, how the founding fathers initially created this political system, the whole idea was they wanted to prevent another Donald Trump from gaining power, right? The whole idea of checks and balances, that we create institutions that can push back against populist demagogues. And what we've seen in arguably the greatest challenge to the American democracy, that these institutions we would hope would stand up have done nothing of the sort, right? The Supreme Court is enabling them. The Congress is enabling them. Same thing, we could talk about the media and these other sort of more informal institutions have not really embraced the role of checking somebody who's looking to essentially be an authoritarian. And I think that's particularly sad as we think about the structure of the democracy on the 4th of July.
I also feel like it's also kind of more difficult in this day and age too, with like the emergence of social media and AI to like even be able to have the average American be able to decipher what is truth and what is false. I don't know. I feel like with just this upcoming election, you were talking about the Senate might be a little bit harder for the Dems to control, but the House, are you worried about the gerrymandering and kind of this sort of illegal way or unconstitutional way that all these different states have decided, well, we're not going to follow the census from 4 or 5 years ago. We're going to take it upon ourselves to change it right now. Do you see that could affect this midterms and actually give it back to the right, though?
Oh, absolutely. It's a possibility, right? And especially as we think about, the gerrymandering, and then some of the fallout from the Supreme Court overturning the Voting Rights Act, right? Sort of enabling this hyper gerrymandering. That all matters. I think about it as two layers, right? There's the gerrymandering, which is occurring prior to the election, and then I'm also very, very worried about how Trump operates, around the election, right? In terms of, is he seizing ballots? Is he targeting, Philadelphia and Chicago and some of these other communities, these black and brown communities, to say like, hey, they always cheat on their votes. Like, I think those are also things I'm really, really worried about. He is laying the seeds for these extra constitutional actions. So the structural stuff in terms of gerrymandering is a big issue. But then the day-to-day, right around the election, I think that's a really big issue. And then the Democratic Party has to be smart about getting its lawyers ready at all levels, on the ground, in these cities, in communities, right? You can't wait for things to happen. They have to be proactive to say, what might Trump do and how do we immediately counter that? Because it feels like we're in a space where, for the first time in our history, somebody may actually try to steal an election. And I don't think that's hyperbolic. I think Trump has said as much in terms of what he wants to do. So I'm really, really worried about this. So
we're about 4 months away from the midterm elections, and I guess with my timeline, like politics, the cycle is so quick sometimes, and I guess it's like more quicker, closer to the election, that you would see kind of something that you were talking about. But have you seen any sort of rumblings that kind of like caught your attention, that like voter suppression or voter intimidation that you would be worried about in 4 months?
Not in terms of that stuff yet. I think that probably occurs as we get closer. But I think what we need to be thinking about is how they're rewriting some of the rules, right? In terms of, when you can vote, who can show up, can you bring people to the polls? That's the sort of stuff that they lay the groundwork for the more immediate stuff you're talking about right prior to the election. And as we think, these rules matter so much, and they're not particularly sexy politics, right? People don't think about when states are rewriting the rules of voting, but a lot of that stuff has been happening over the last couple of years to make it more difficult. I mean, I think if we think about Trump's Save America Act or whatever the voting legislation he's trying to pursue, if that were to be implemented, that's really terrifying when we think about, okay, you've got to prove citizenship to register. I mean, it's that's one of those levels where suddenly you are disenfranchising huge segments of the democracy, including a lot of traditional Republicans, right? So the idea is we want to encourage more people to get access to the polls. And I think there are a lot of forces out there being led by the president trying to make that more difficult. And again, we should all, as citizens, not as necessarily Democrats or Republicans, as citizens, be worried about those movements.
Is there precedent for this? Have we seen precedent where, I'd like to believe that when there's legislation, when it regards voting, that they'd wait an entire election cycle to implement that. But it feels like they're really trying to rush a lot of this stuff right away, recklessly, in the actual calendar year of the midterm. Is this something that's just kind of unprecedented that they be fast tracking this?
Definitely. As we think about, especially thinking about in terms of like the gerrymandering, the redistricting, all of that, the census is every 10 years. And so when that happens, there was always a lot of contentious politics surrounding that. But we've never seen this sort of in, mid-election as things are going. Let's try to change them in the process. Everything is occurring much more quickly. And that creates the space for manipulation, for abuse, and for disenfranchisement. Like all of those things are really, really concerning. And I think largely because there's a tolerance on the right to many of these practices. It used to be that, there was a bipartisan consensus like, hey, we want to encourage people to vote. And maybe behind the scenes, there was a little bit of trying to, make it more difficult to vote on the Republican side. But in general, now there's just no bipartisan consensus that we should have a free and fair election. That's sort of gone away. Those norms have gone away. And I think about all of the dangerous things that have emerged from the Trump presidency, in particular. The second one is these democratic norms eroding. Those are hard to fix. It's hard to go back and start over when you undermine these sort of core democratic principles and norms.
I know Trump's trying to hijack, other legislative efforts in order to push the SAVE Act. Do you foresee that could actually happen since they do have the numbers with the majority in the House and possibly hijacking the Senate to at least, I don't know if there'd be any Democrats that would vote for that, but right. Do you foresee that we would be maybe in like another sort of holding pattern or government shutdown or something of the like in order to get the SAVE Act finished?
This is a real test for the Republicans, right? Especially Senate Republicans, because they've sent a message to Trump. They're not going to do this. He doesn't have the numbers yet. And that's encouraging, right? At least when you come to this, they say, hey, we're not going to do this because it's bad for everybody. Now, what happens, though, is Trump is going to continue to use fear and pressure to try to get them to cave. And he has been very successful using fear. Now, the question is whether that's starting to fade a little bit, right? Can he still call people out? Can he still put his thumb on the scale for all of these things? I certainly hope not, because it does feel like some of his power is starting to drift a little bit. There's more criticism of him. He seems less effective. It's hard to know whether it's age or, sort of these delusions of authoritarian grandeur are sort of undermining him. But it seems like Senate Republicans are less likely to go along with this. Now, even if that's the case, it doesn't mean he doesn't try to do some of this via executive order. Now, I think the courts would likely throw a lot of that out, but that's a lot of trust we're putting in courts, and in particular the Supreme Court. So I would like to say there's no chance any of this happens, but I didn't think, a lot of these things that have happened would actually happen, right? I didn't think we'd give immunity to presidents, before that decision came down. I said, there's no way this is going to happen. I was shocked that the birthright citizenship case was 5-4. I mean, so many of these things should have been no-brainers, should have been 9-0, and we're in this world where we can't assume that's going to be the case anymore.
And you said you're surprised by it, but don't you kind of think that the Trump administration, part 1 and part 2, has kind of been the ultimate test of this democracy in the sense that, well, what can the executive branch get away with? I mean, I know you and I can sit here philosophically and say, well, that's pretty obvious what they wrote down, what they wanted, but the fact that it gets reinterpreted, I don't know, is that when we sum up the Trump administration, is that something where we're going to be like, well, he at least kind of put all of our feet to the fire to at least determine who we are as a nation?
100%, right? I think about, how many times I've heard, people like these, people pull the Constitution out of their pocket and say the Constitution is going to save us. And I'm like, no, not anymore, right? So much of our political system was dependent upon restraint and norms, politicians doing the right thing because you just don't go there. And Trump is like, I'm going to go there. And you try to stop me. And what we've seen is that nobody is really willing to stop him. Fear has been incredibly effective. So yeah, I'm really worried about all of those things because it's not just Trump. It's setting a precedent for future presidents as well, where they say, hey, this previous guy did it. I'm going to do it. One of the things we've seen over the history of the presidency is presidents don't give power back. Whether it's a Democrat or Republican. Think about, at the end of the George W. Bush administration, everybody was up in arms over all the power that George W. Bush had as a president. And Barack Obama came in and said, I'm not going to abuse these powers and I'm not going to torture. And that was true. But he still didn't give all that power back. He's like, this is sort of useful. And then it continues to grow. So whatever Trump does in terms of breaking down the norms and the traditional walls of the presidency, future presidents are likely going to keep much of that power. And again, I don't think that's particularly good for government as well.
Do you think we'll ever have a president in the future that won't be so influenced by maybe corporate sort of interests that he would have the moral backbone, or he or she would have the moral backbone to kind of reset what the executive branch should look like?
I would hope so. I would hope we could get to that point. And it was interesting. Bernie Sanders was interviewed yesterday and talking about all the corruption and all the news over this week about Trump and the billions of dollars he's made off the presidency. And we've never seen anything like that in the United States. And we've actually never seen anything like that in the history of sort of Western democracy. Silvio Berlusconi, the old prime minister for Italy, was the only thing that was close to it. And Trump is far beyond that. And so they were asking Bernie about this. And he went on and he said, you know what? I'm really optimistic about what's happening at the ground level. I'm really excited about young people who are tired of this corruption, tired of this mismanagement. And I will say, I was a little skeptical. I'm like, Bernie, I'm not seeing any evidence of this actually working, but it does make me feel good that he looks out there and says, I think there's going to be a wave. I think there's going to be some pushback. And the only, I think, good thing that comes from Trump blowing up our political system is that it does create space to try something new. And if Democrats just say let's go back to the old system, let's go back to, Joe Biden and let's go back to Bill Clinton, that will be a terrible mistake because Trump has broke everything and it creates an opportunity to rebuild. And so my hope and what I would encourage Democrats to do is to do what you say, start thinking about some of these problems and how do we address inequality? How do we address corruption? How do we address a hyper-partisan political system? How do we become pragmatic problem solvers? I would love to see the Democratic Party seize upon that opportunity and do some of those things.
Well, it seems like the shift in the party itself is going kind of to the extreme left, the democratic socialism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe in politics, it tends to be a pendulum that overall will swing one way or the other. We're in an extreme right phase right now, a fascist almost regime. Do you foresee, and of course, with some of the elections we've seen already, we've seen Democrats win in Texas. We saw the Zoran Mamdani candidates that won in New York recently. And all of the different editorials, op-eds that I've been reading that whether it's people on the left or especially people on the right that are just kind of quaking in their boots right now about this wave of democratic socialism. I mean, do you think that's how the pendulum is swinging, or do you think that the party is going to eat itself and kind of prevent the democratic socialists from kind of having a footing?
It's a really important question, right? It's too hard to know right now. I think the Democrats are trying to say we're a Big Tent party, and I think that's what they should be doing. And you can have more centrist candidates running in Texas, like Tallarico, I think is a fantastic option for that Texas environment. In other Democratic spaces, you can push further to the left. The one thing I think is really important for the Democratic Socialist movement is that they remain pragmatic, right? So Mamdani has been so interesting in New York because he is a democratic socialist, but he's trying to solve problems, right? He's the guy thinking about, let's address the potholes, let's think about housing. And as long as he's doing that, I think there's political space for that kind of that group within the Democratic Party, right? The one thing we've seen where Democrats have gotten into trouble electorally is when they spend too much time talking about the sort of the cultural issues. Now, I think those are central to what the Democratic Party wants to do. But when you talk about those issues, it makes it easy for the right to paint you as a certain way. But when Mamdani goes out there and just starts solving problems, it becomes more difficult, right? And I think that's the strategy. It's not just what you want to do, but how the other side is going to portray you. And that's what I think, the Democratic Socialists have to be careful about how they approach that. If they come across as problem solvers who are like, hey, yeah, we believe in healthcare and we believe in, taxing the rich to solve some of these problems, right? Those are issues that have broad appeal. We are living in a moment where populism on the left and the right can be very, very popular. And if you are a pragmatic populist on the left, I think there's a chance for real success.
I talked about with Professor Kevin Schultz about the identity politics of the left and how they're kind of steering away in this election from maybe not going so big about Israel-Palestine, maybe kind of staying away from LGBTQ to kind of prevent scaring off maybe people that might be in the center or the right. I mean, do you think that's a successful strategy going into November?
We'll see. I think it has potential, right? So if we look at Hungary, right? So Hungary just voted out Viktor Orban, this right-wing populist. And what was so fascinating about that, how they defeated him was focusing on corruption. And all the way that he, the ways in which he was corrupted, and specifically how that corruption was hurting everyday people. And I thought it was just a brilliant campaign. So I do think there's a lot of space for that here. Go after Republicans, go after Trump for the corruption, and don't give up on those other other issues, trans rights and all those other issues, but maybe don't make them the leading issue because it plays so well into Trump. Those are complicated issues, and Trump has a way of simplifying them. So I think they're important. The Israel issue is a really interesting one because one of the things that we've seen in Democratic primaries is that Democratic voters have moved in a much more anti-Israel direction. And I think as we think about foreign policy moving forward, I think the Democratic Party is going to be much more critical of Israel. I think conversations about withholding aid are going to be much more central. I think those things are also going to occur on the right moving forward. But I think if Israel is going to be worried about this because there are a lot of people saying we shouldn't be using U.S. taxpayer funds for weapons that are targeting Palestinians and engaging in war crimes. Like that conversation is occurring. And I don't know how that plays politically, but certainly in the primaries, we're seeing a new sort of way that the Democratic Party is thinking about Israel. And I think that would be a dramatic shift. And again, it's hard to know how that plays in a general election, but we're certainly seeing it play out in the primaries.
So let's pretend for a second that the Democrats win the House in November. Maybe they hold a little bit of a majority or it's even in the Senate going into the next Congress. So I would assume that the House would present the third impeachment of Donald Trump. Whether, what they would go on, I don't know, but I'm sure there's a case to be made for just about anything that we've talked about already. At this point, though, do you feel that it would just kind of be for show and only just to present the moral obligation to impeach Trump? Or do you think that they could actually censure him, get him out of office, and we'll never see him again?
I don't think they have the votes for that. And so then the question you raise is an important one, because if you don't have the votes to win, do you bring the case? Because there's a lot of other ways that you could expose the corruption of Trump. You could have nonstop investigations, bring the cabinet in, hold their feet to the fire in politically effective ways. And I think that could be really valuable. The impeachment stuff can oftentimes backfire, right? So I think they would have to be real careful about how they're going to proceed. Now, I think there's more than enough evidence on just a whole bunch of issues for impeachment. I think the president should be impeached. I think I would hope that he could be removed, but the Republicans probably aren't going to do that. And if that's not going to happen, then be strategic about how you expose Trump, the corruption, all of what's going on here, the family connections, all of that. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around all of what's going on right now in terms of the Trump family, the Witkoffs, the Kushners. I mean, we've never seen anything like this. So, hey, let's expose some of that and have real conversations about it. And there's part of me that thinks the impeachment process may take away from that. Use the power to carry out investigations and expose it, and maybe save impeachment unless you think you got the numbers.
I would like to believe that there will be a point in time where Trump will be in the rearview mirror. When that happens, or when it's looking like that's approaching, do you foresee that there will be people within the Republican Party that are going to start turning away from him and start maybe saying, oh, I was never with him? Or I guess essentially what we saw with like Thomas Massie, how he got pushed out, but he was very vocal on some of the things that he disagreed with Donald Trump. Do you foresee more people kind of stepping up and doing that and are just too afraid to right now?
Yeah, definitely. When he goes away, the fear of Donald Trump will lessen, right? And so I think that can enable Republicans to try to recapture their party. But just like the Democrats, they're not going to go back to Mitt Romney and that sort of philosophy. And then the thing I spend a lot of time thinking about is what happens to Trumpism after Trump? because he's an ism now, and Trumpism is going to persist because, I mean, J.D. Vance, even Marco Rubio, Marco Rubio has sold his soul to the devil and leaned into Trumpism. And so this idea and this ism is here, and it's probably here for a while. So I don't know how that looks moving forward, but I think it's here. It's certainly a contingent of the Republican base right now. So even after Trump, I think we have to contend with Trumpism, but it might look different. It might be a little bit different, but I think the core element is going to be with us for a while. And again, I think that presents some real opportunities for Democrats to say, hey, is this what we want to do? Do we want to continue to spend all of our time talking about, who's playing what sports? Do we want to continue to spend all of our time doing this? Or do we want to talk about solving problems? So again, an opportunity for Democrats. But yeah, I think Trumpism is going to outlive Trump himself.
And I know we're way early on it, but how do you foresee 2028 going down? Is it going to be President Trump trying to go for a third term? Will it be President Vance trying to defend his administration? Will it be infighting between Vance and Rubio for the nomination in 2028? Will J.B. Pritzker have a shot versus Gavin Newsom or Cory Booker or Wes Moore or whoever is on the left? How do you foresee it going down? I know it's way early. Yeah. I'm not going to hold you to a prediction. And, and I know things could change in the last 3 months before November of 2028. But how do you see it about 2.5 years ahead of time?
Yeah, I think the question we have to start with is Trump on the ballot? And I know everybody says, there's no way he's going to be on the ballot.
I see Trump 28 flags wherever I go out in the sticks. It's crazy to me.
Exactly. 100%. And people don't authoritarians don't do the sort of things that Trump has done and then just leave office, right? Think about all the authoritarians they do many of the same things that Donald Trump has done, and they don't walk away. So it's possible that Trump says, all right, I'm done. But I think that's the first question. Does he try to get around this? Does he try to find a way onto the ballot? I think there are a whole host of things. So that's the first issue. And I'm not convinced that he is simply going to walk away. I hope he does. But I think that's the first question. Then the second question is, if he does walk away, where do we lean? And again, the leading contenders are, we're thinking about Rubio and Vance and how that plays out. I will say, J.D. Vance still doesn't strike me as the same sort of politician as Donald Trump. He's tried to emulate Donald Trump. He's just not as good at it. I think, it could be Rubio. He sort of positioned himself interestingly. He stayed out of the fire a little bit. But we also might see somebody from the right wing, media environment jump in, a Tucker Carlson, right? I think about the one individual who stayed loyal to that original sort of MAGA base ideology has been Tucker. And so if Trump goes away and Trumpism continues, he might pick up that mantle. So I think there's a lot of directions there. I'm not leaning toward Vance. I really think a Tucker could be somebody who could kind of run and do really well. On the Democratic side, I think this is also really, really fascinating and probably too early to know anything tangible, because we see sometimes these candidates emerge, like a Barack Obama didn't emerge until late in the process. But I do think we're going to see more candidates like Gavin Newsom who embrace a little bit of the Trumpist style. They're aggressive. They go, they're very confrontational. Pritzker, I think, fits in that category as well. We're going to see more Democratic candidates like that. And I think probably less Pete Buttigieg, sort of the intellectual Democratic candidate. I think we're more likely to see the whole political system shift towards the dynamics that Donald Trump has created. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but I think that's probably what you need to do to win an election. And if you're the Democratic Party right now, the most important thing is winning elections, right? You have to do this. You have to find a way to connect with people. You got to win elections. So I think I think it's just going to be, these midterms are going to be bonkers, and I can't even think about how crazy 2028 is going to be. I mean, there are just so many issues. It'll be an election we've never seen before.
It's kind of spur of the moment question. Let's say the Democrats win the House this November. Who do you think ends up becoming their Speaker of the House? Would it be Hakeem Jeffries, or do you think they'd steer away from him?
He seems to continue to have support, but none of that is guaranteed anymore, right? And I think one of the things for the Democrats, as I mentioned earlier, is that they can have real conversations about what's a priority for the party. So he's obviously the leading contender. But I think somebody like AOC or somebody else who's maybe a little bit further to the left, somebody who might want to push some of these populist issues, I think there's some space for that as well. Now, Hakeem has been smart about sort of drifting a little bit to the left as well. He understands where his coalition is. But I'm looking forward to this. Like the Chuck Schumer era is certainly over, right? That's done in the Senate. I think there's going to be an upheaval there as well if that were to happen. But again, I encourage all of this. Democrats should have big questions. They should have uncomfortable conversations. Everything's on the table, and that's a really important part of democracy is to get through that so you come across as an authentic party.
Well, speaking of uncomfortable conversations, it seems like the looming dinosaur while we're trying to celebrate this country and anticipate what our country is going to look like is what's going on in the world. You've got Ukraine and Russia still continuing their fight 5 years later. You still have what's going on with China and Taiwan. Meanwhile, the United States and their relationship with Iran and how is the Strait of Hormuz open? Is that deal worked out? What have they agreed to? Now, as someone that has kind of a loose interpretation of history and all these history classes that I've taken in my life, it feels like when you talk about these rumblings, it leads to a world war, that things could be so unstable that maybe someone takes advantage of the moment or someone tries to seize some power. Are you afraid that that is kind of the looming dinosaur of what's going on in the world while we're trying to have our own battles here in the United States?
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility, right? Because we think about Trump has not only blown up the U.S. domestic political system, but he's also broken up or blown up the international system. So the liberal international economic order has been, NATO, all of those things are in tatters right now, and it creates space for new dynamics. And I think the most important international dynamic we're watching right now is the emergence of China. And China is now a global power. They are getting close to being on par with the United States. It's possible over the next decade they may pass the United States in terms of economic power. And what we've seen throughout history, in those moments where an existing power is challenged by a rising power, it puts you in a window where conflict is much more likely. Throughout history, we've seen that. Now, one hopes that this era of globalization and technology and all of that maybe tamps down some of those incentives, but we should be honest about the fact that we're entering an era of uncertainty, unpredictability. There are a lot of international actors that are now doing things because the United States is no longer trying to control or dictate or manage the international system. So there's a more chaotic element to that. And anytime that enters the arena, yes, the possibility of conflict emerges. Now, the follow-up question is that what does conflict look like in the 21st century, right? We watch what's playing out in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia right now. So fascinating the way in which technology and drones are fundamentally altering that conflict. In many ways, that feels like World War I, where the casualty rates are skyrocketing, but that's because of this technology. It's like drones are the new machine guns, right? And so all of these questions are up in the air.
I guess you couple that, too, with the fact that it's not so much infantry wars like it used to be, but then you hear sources saying that Russia might have lost 500,000 soldiers through this, this encounter with Ukraine. You're right, though. I think we look at what would a World War III look like, or how would it play out? Would we as civilians be enjoying our casual everyday lives while the world is completely falling apart? I don't know.
Yeah, right. And yeah, do we have our soldiers actually fighting anymore, or is it all drone warfare? I think one thing we've learned from the U.S. war with Iran is that military might isn't as decisive as it once used to be. So, the United States is so much more powerful militarily than Iran, but that hasn't mattered. And I don't know if we're at the end of this conflict, but as we look at it right now, Iran really has tremendous amount of leverage. It feels like Iran may not have won this war, but they certainly didn't lose it. The United States is losing this war. And a lot of that is because of technology and the inability of these sort of more traditional military means to change the environment on the ground. So there are so many things that are different now. And I think if you look at the Iran war and you look at the Ukraine war, it gives us a preview of what that might look like. Again, drones, technology, cyber warfare, all of these things are the future of warfare.
Oh, it's so interesting. Before I let you go, minority owner of the Green Bay Packers, that's news to me. I want to say I heard you say that you were a Packers fan once, but what's the backstory on that? Are you a Wisconsinite?
I am. I'm a cheesehead,
Okay.
and yes, actually grew up in Milwaukee. And my dad actually he has the old Milwaukee season tickets, so we go up. You know, my dad who's 83 still. We still go to Packer games, and it's not something I generally share in Illinois. It's a tougher audience down here, but yeah, definitely. And then the last time the Packers had where they were selling their stock, I got a share. So I have one share of Green Bay Packers stock. That everybody's probably just turning the radio off, Paul. They're like, oh, who's this guy? But yeah.
No, I think it's hilarious. That's really neat. I didn't know that I was talking to an NFL owner this entire time.
That's right. Yes.
He's Professor William Muck. He is a professor of political science at North Central College, also co-host of the podcast Politics Lab. You've also heard him on various shows here, whether it's Joan Esposito, Edwin show. He fills in from time to time. Bill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Have a happy 4th of July, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Sounds great.
All right, that was Professor William Muck, who I had a chance to talk to yesterday. If you've got fast fingers, 773-763-9278. Got a few minutes left before the end of the show this week here on the 4th of July. Want to take your call. I know a few people were trying to get in on the text line, wasn't able to get through while we had these interviews going on. Didn't want to keep you on hold for the entire half hour that I was talking to that pre-record with Professor Muck. But catching up on some of the stuff that we saw on the text line, Patrick from LaGrange Park said he tried calling in, wanted to respond from Brian from Albuquerque who called in. Brian from Albuquerque was saying that it was the Democrats in Illinois funding the pensions in the 80s and then not having a way to continuously fund it. And that's why Illinois is in the situation that they're in with higher tax rates, higher property taxes, different sorts of styles of government that we see and how past governing in Illinois has kind of led to this problem in this present day. But he wanted to say it was under Governor Thompson and Edgar, who were Republican governors, that they borrowed against the pensions, that they didn't have to raise taxes for those 16 years. But they also said if we brought the lottery to Illinois, they'd use that money for education, which is true, but that's a weasel word. They used it for the money to replace the education budget, not on top of the education budget. And of course, we've seen other revenue-generating services that were possibly outsourced, like the open road tolling that Rob Blagojevich originally brought to Illinois, but then it was sold off, or like we've seen in the city of Chicago with parking meters, or the various ways that you see some of these things that are outsourced to a private company rather than the local government that's trying to implement these taxes to begin with. Greg from Lake in the Hills texted. He says his take on Tucker Carlson is that he is so disingenuous that I would never consider words coming out of his mouth to be anything but deceitful, self-entitled lies. I cannot stomach them. Greg, I agree with you. I can't take Tucker Carlson seriously. I think there's a lot of people. I think anybody that was a Trump apologist that is 180ing on him right now, I can't totally take you at face value. At the very least, I'd like to believe that Tucker Carlson has seen the light, but at the same time, he's been caping for these guys for so long that I don't know what changed. Was he just not invited to the parties? Did he, someone look at him the wrong way? I don't know what sort of moral awakening that Tucker Carlson had, and I unfortunately, I am to believe that he's just going to wait for the next opportunity to be who he is. I hope he's not a presidential candidate in 2028. I hope we never do have a television personality as a presidential candidate. Like, I don't want to see Jon Stewart as president, as much as I would probably follow along with what he said, and the fact that even like Jon Stewart has gone in front of a congressional committee to fight for, health care for those who served in 9/11 and may have had health issues as the result of the dust that they inhaled from the Twin Towers coming down. So at the very least that someone like Jon Stewart versus a Tucker Carlson at least has political experience, albeit small. But I think we need to hold our politicians to more accountability. We need politicians that aren't going to fall prey to government or to corporate money, to money that will dictate and influence them into what they're going to be as a politician. Because I think we see too many times that people are running on one thing, and then when you find out who is funding them, who wanted them to be in power, what money put them in that place, that they tend to gravitate towards the money rather than the will of the people. All they're doing is buying your vote. It doesn't matter if the majority was behind you. They're going to do what they're going to do when they get into office. We need to hold them accountable because there are flaws within both parties where they do fall prey to corporate interest. They do fall prey to those that are trying to influence both sides as long as they get their way. So we got to be better as citizens. We got to be more accountable. That it does get turned back on us. The state of this nation is that it got here because of us. And we can undo it. We can make it a better nation through the power of the people. Folks, my name is Paul Chivari. I filled in for Edwin Eisendrath this week. I want to thank you for giving me your time. I want to wish you all a happy Independence Day. Edwin will be back next week. Stick around. We got more programming left for you today here on WCPT. Ellie Krug is next. We got Ben Jarofsky after that. Damian Perdue will be in with Think Theory Radio at 6 o'clock. So long, everybody. Edwin will be back next week. Happy 4th of July.